The story of the conquistadors begins long before their sails touched the shores of the Caribbean, long before their banners were raised in cities of gold, or their names were written in chronicles of conquest. To understand the men who crossed the Atlantic and carved empires in lands unknown to them, it is necessary to first understand the soil from which they came, the Iberian Peninsula at the close of the Middle Ages. It was a land forged through centuries of struggle, a crossroads where civilizations clashed and coexisted, where war and religion shaped society, and where ambitions grew larger than the boundaries of the peninsula itself. For centuries, Iberia had been a mosaic of cultures. The Romans had once marched across its plains, building cities and roads, leaving their imprint in law, language, and infrastructure that outlasted their empire. The Visigoths came after, establishing fragile kingdoms that faltered in the face of new forces. In 711, Arab and Berber armies crossed from North Africa, and with them came the establishment of Muslim rule in much of the peninsula. The brilliance of Al-Andalus illuminated Iberian culture for centuries, bringing advances in agriculture, architecture, science, and philosophy. Córdoba, Granada, and Seville flourished as centres of learning and artistry, while Christian kingdoms to the north clung to survival, building their strength in the mountains and slowly pressing southward. The coexistence between Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities created a unique environment, marked by exchange as much as by tension. Languages blended, trade networks intertwined, and ideas travelled along roads where soldiers also marched. Yet while the coexistence gave Iberia a rich cultural depth, it also left it divided, contested, and ever restless. The long wars of the Reconquista defined the Iberian spirit. For centuries, Christian rulers portrayed their expansion not only as territorial conquest, but as a sacred mission. Kings of Castile and Aragon, nobles from Leon, Navarre, and Portugal, all justified their wars as acts of faith, each new fortress taken and each city seized celebrated as divine favour. Young men grew up in this environment of constant struggle, where honour was measured in battle, where nobility was proved through arms, and where fortune often depended on risk and violence. Even the smallest victories could transform a family's status, and the habit of war created generations accustomed to the sword. The peninsula's nobility was saturated with martial values, and its common people were drawn into the service of campaigns that promised spoils, land, or exemption from obligations. A warrior culture had been forged through repetition, and its momentum did not vanish with the fall of Granada, but carried forward into the new age of transoceanic conquest. Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia, fell in 1492. Its capture by Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile symbolised more than the end of Muslim political power. It was the final act of a centuries-long struggle that gave Spain a sense of divine election, the belief that their kings ruled with heavenly sanction. At the same moment, the monarchs turned inward against their own subjects, launching the Spanish Inquisition to enforce religious conformity, expelling Jews and later Muslims who refused conversion. Religious identity hardened into a pillar of social and political life. Orthodoxy was enforced through fear, exile, and surveillance. This insistence on purity and conformity shaped the world view of those who later went abroad, a world divided between true Christians and others, a hierarchy in which power was justified by faith. The rigid structures of Iberian society would find echoes in the colonies, where race, religion, and loyalty became markers of status. Portugal developed on a slightly different trajectory, though it shared many of these same patterns. It emerged earlier as an independent kingdom and turned quickly to the sea. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese mariners had begun exploring the coast of Africa by the early 15th century. They developed techniques of navigation, designed new types of ships like the caravel, and experimented with longer voyages into the Atlantic. The Azores, Madeira, and the Canary Islands became laboratories for colonization, places where the Portuguese learned how to establish settlements, cultivate cash crops, and exploit enslaved labour. These early experiments foreshadowed the methods that would later be used on a vast scale in the Americas. Portuguese voyages also brought them into contact with gold, ivory and slaves from West Africa, creating profitable networks that enriched the crown and emboldened further expeditions. Spain, unified later, would follow this maritime model but with an eye westward. The economic structure of Iberia was fragile. Despite the prestige of its monarchs, Spain was not among the wealthiest regions of Europe. Its agriculture was uneven, its industries limited, and much of its land was controlled by a few nobles and by the church. Many nobles were impoverished, maintaining their status by bloodline and military service rather than by wealth. Younger sons, deprived of inheritance by laws of primogeniture, sought fortune in war, in administration, or later in voyages overseas. A restless class of hidalgos emerged, minor nobles with little land but great pride, for whom honour was everything. Their ambitions could not be contained within the confines of Castile and Aragon. They were eager to risk their lives for a chance at wealth, reputation, and service to the crown. It was this class of men, shaped by poverty and pride, who became the backbone of the conquistador expeditions. Peasants in Iberia bore heavy burdens, tied to the land and obligated to their lords, while townsmen engaged in commerce that was modest compared with the great trading hubs of Italy or the Hanseatic League. Yet Iberian towns provided a pool of artisans, sailors and merchants who supported overseas ventures. Ships were built in their docks, crews recruited in their taverns. Trade routes through the Mediterranean and Atlantic already linked Iberia to broader networks, bringing in goods and ideas. Still, compared with Italy or Northern Europe, Iberia lagged in wealth and commerce, making the lure of overseas riches all the more powerful. The hope of gold and land across the ocean was magnified by the relative scarcity of opportunity at home. Technological progress gave Iberians the means to pursue their ambitions. The magnetic compass, the astrolabe, and advances in cartography made navigation across open seas possible. The caravel, with its lateen sails and agile design, allowed sailors to tack against the wind and endure long journeys. These innovations, borrowed, adapted, and perfected through contact with Arab and Mediterranean traditions, transformed Iberians from coastal sailors into oceanic navigators. The spirit of experimentation was alive in Portuguese and Spanish ports. Sailors learned from each voyage, correcting maps, refining techniques, and passing down knowledge through experience as much as through books. When Columbus proposed his westward route, he was drawing on this accumulated culture of navigation, even if his calculations were deeply flawed. Religion infused every aspect of Iberian life. The victories of the Reconquista were celebrated as triumphs of the faith, and the expulsion of Jews and Muslims was justified as cleansing the body politic of impurity. This militant religiosity did not vanish with the fall of Granada. Instead, it sought new outlets. Overseas exploration became an extension of the same crusading mentality. The conversion of non-Christians was seen as a duty, conquest framed as service to God as much as to king. Missionaries would accompany expeditions, and conquistadors themselves believed that their violent acts could be sanctified by the spread of the faith. This mindset made them both ruthless and convinced of righteousness, able to reconcile the pursuit of wealth with the claim of serving divine will. The division of the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, sanctioned by papal decree, illustrates the audacity of Iberian ambition. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, following earlier agreements, drew a line across the globe and assigned spheres of influence to each crown. The Portuguese focused on Africa, India and the East, while Spain looked westward. To modern eyes, the arrogance is staggering. Entire continents, unknown and unexplored, divided as if they were spoils already won. Yet for Iberians of the 15th century, this division reflected their worldview, the conviction that they were chosen instruments of God, entrusted with dominion over lands not yet under Christian rule. This framework of entitlement would carry into every conquest, shaping the way conquistadors interacted with indigenous peoples and justified their actions. The Iberian Peninsula at the dawn of the Age of Discovery was thus a land of paradoxes. It was poor in material wealth yet rich in ambition, fractured by centuries of conflict yet newly united, devoutly religious yet driven by hunger for gold and glory. It produced men accustomed to war, shaped by exclusionary religious policies, and emboldened by new technologies of navigation. The conquistadors who would later cross the ocean carried these legacies with them. They were not anomalies, but products of this environment, embodying its strengths and its brutalities. Their readiness to gamble everything on uncertain ventures was born of a homeland where fortune often depended on risk, and where honour was valued above life itself. When Columbus set sail westward in 1492, he did so against this backdrop. His voyage was not an isolated accident, but the natural extension of Iberian patterns of expansion and ambition. The peninsula had produced generations who lived on frontiers, who fought for land and faith, who sought opportunities beyond their immediate world. Now, with the Atlantic opening before them, that same spirit was carried across the seas, reshaping continents and histories far from the shores of Spain and Portugal. The men who later marched under banners in Mexico, Peru, and beyond were not born into a vacuum. Their ways of thinking, their sense of honour, their notions of justice and violence were all shaped by the long shadow of the Reconquista. The centuries of struggle that pushed Muslim power southward and eventually expelled it from the Iberian Peninsula had forged not only kingdoms and borders, but also a cultural tradition of warfare unlike any other in Europe. It was not simply about defending territory, but about the fusion of faith and violence into a worldview that sanctified conquest and rewarded those who risked their lives for it. This tradition made the Iberian warrior both hardened and restless, deeply bound to his society yet eager to seek fortunes where opportunities were scarce. The Reconquista stretched across nearly 8 centuries, a span of time that made it far more than a single campaign. It was a cycle of advance and retreat, of truces and crusades, of coexistence punctuated by sudden explosions of violence. Villages changed hands, cities were besieged, alliances shifted. A young man growing up in the highlands of Castile or the valleys of Aragon might see war not as an extraordinary event but as part of the rhythm of life. To fight was to fulfill both duty and ambition. Honour was measured in scars and in captured standards, in land grants received from victorious monarchs, and in stories sung by poets who immortalised campaigns against Moorish strongholds. Tales of El Cid, real and embellished, circulated for centuries, presenting the warrior as both loyal vassal and daring opportunist, who carved his own destiny through arms. Religion gave these wars a unifying language. To seize a fortress or raid across a frontier was not only an act of politics or economics, but also a holy act. Priests blessed banners before battles. Sermons promised heavenly reward to those who died in combat against non-Christians, and monarchs proclaimed themselves champions of the faith. Papal bulls declared indulgences for those who participated in campaigns against Muslim-held lands, placing them in the same spiritual category as those who fought in the Holy Land. For ordinary soldiers and impoverished knights, this fusion of faith and warfare provided meaning and justification for violence. It told them that service in battle was not merely for personal gain, but for God, a narrative powerful enough to sustain generations of warriors through hardship. The Reconquista also produced a pattern of settlement that trained Iberians in the methods they would later employ overseas. When land was retaken from Muslim rulers, it was distributed to those who had fought for it. Nobles received large estates, monasteries and churches gained donations of property, and townsmen secured charters that freed them from older obligations. New towns were founded on the frontiers, populated by Christians brought from the north, while Muslims who remained were often reduced to tenants or expelled altogether. This process of conquest followed by colonization created a cycle that repeated across centuries. By the time Granada fell, Iberians were accustomed to the idea that land won by the sword was land to be divided, that war was the surest path to wealth, and that the dispossession of others could be justified through religious sanction. The warrior tradition was reinforced by social structures. The nobility was saturated with martial expectations. To be noble was to fight, to lead men in war, and to prove oneself in combat. Wealth could ebb and flow, but honour was permanent, rooted in bloodline and service. Even minor nobles with little land, the hidalgos, guarded their status fiercely. They might be poor, but they carried themselves as men of rank, refusing to engage in manual labour and living instead by service, pensions, or military ventures. Many of these men, with limited prospects at home, became eager participants in expeditions abroad, where they could hope for rewards greater than anything available in Castile or Aragon. The ethos of the hidalgo, proud, ambitious, disdainful of trade but hungry for honour, would leave a deep imprint on the character of the conquistadors. The culture of the Reconquista also made violence personal. Wars were not distant conflicts, but encounters with neighbours, with towns across the frontier, with people who shared similar languages and customs but were divided by faith. Raiding was common, carried out by small bands who sought plunder, captives, and reputation. These raids kept skills sharp and produced a warrior style suited not only to pitched battles, but also to sudden strikes and ruthless pragmatism. Such methods would later serve conquistadors well in the Americas, where they faced unfamiliar terrains and peoples. They were not armies trained only for set-piece battles, but men accustomed to improvisation, ambush, and the harsh realities of frontier war. The Reconquista also tied warriors closely to their monarchs. Kings rewarded service with titles, lands, and privileges, binding nobles to the crown through grants. Yet loyalty was often fragile. Ambitious captains could switch allegiance, carve out territories for themselves, or pursue private wars if they believed opportunity favoured them. This mixture of loyalty and self-interest created a pattern mirrored in the Americas, where conquistadors swore service to the king, yet often acted with great independence, seizing land and treasure while claiming to represent royal authority. The crown tolerated this so long as conquest was secured and tribute flowed, but tensions frequently arose between ambitious leaders in the field and bureaucrats who sought to impose order afterward. Religion and warfare remained entwined even at the level of daily life. Orders of knights, such as Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara, became major institutions in Iberia. They combined monastic vows with military duties, owning vast lands and commanding armies. Their members saw themselves as both monks and warriors, embodying the fusion of piety and violence. These orders grew wealthy and powerful, sometimes rivaling monarchs in influence. When Ferdinand and Isabella absorbed their leadership into the crown, they strengthened the monarchy's ability to direct military and religious energies toward unified goals. The order's example, however, lived on in the mindset of men who saw no contradiction between the cross and the sword. The Reconquista also left psychological marks on Iberian society. Generations grew up believing that the struggle between Christianity and Islam was a central axis of history. The victory at Granada reinforced the conviction that divine favour rested on Spanish arms, that conquest was both destiny and duty. This worldview made it easier to extend the same logic across the Atlantic. Indigenous peoples could be cast into the role of infidels, and campaigns against them framed as continuations of the same holy struggle. The familiarity of this narrative provided comfort to men far from home, assuring them that their battles in Mexico or Peru were part of the same sacred history as the sieges of Toledo or Granada. At the same time, the Reconquista had created a class of veterans accustomed to war but suddenly deprived of it. After 1492, with Granada subdued, many soldiers and captains found themselves without employment. Their skills were no longer needed at home, and their ambitions exceeded what peaceful Iberia could offer. Exploration and conquest overseas provided an outlet for this restless energy. Men who might have grown idle or rebellious in Spain instead sought fortunes abroad. Their training, their sense of destiny, and their hunger for opportunity converged in the Americas. The warrior tradition was also steeped in expectations of personal glory. Chronicles and ballads celebrated individual deeds, not merely collective victories. A knight who scaled a wall first, who seized an enemy banner, or who fought valiantly against overwhelming odds could secure a reputation that outlasted him. This culture of fame encouraged risk-taking and daring, qualities that defined many conquistadors. In the jungles of Central America or the highlands of the Andes, they would gamble everything on bold maneuvers, convinced that fortune favoured the brave. The ethos of the Reconquista told them that even in defeat, honour was preserved through courage, while victory could elevate a man from obscurity to legend. The Reconquista also hardened Iberians to brutality. The displacement of Muslim and Jewish populations, the enslavement of captives, and the destruction of towns were not exceptional but part of normal warfare. Mercy was rare, and conquest was expected to bring subjugation. The legal systems that developed justified such practices, codifying the rights of conquerors and the subordination of the conquered. These legal traditions would cross the Atlantic, where they provided frameworks for the dispossession of indigenous peoples. The harshness of Iberian frontier war thus set precedents for even harsher conquests abroad. It is also significant that Iberia's warrior tradition coexisted with deep religiosity. Soldiers prayed before battle, confessed their sins, and carried relics and crosses into combat. They sought absolution for violence even as they embraced it. This duality allowed men to act with ferocity while maintaining a sense of righteousness. The conquistadors inherited this same duality, slaughtering in the name of God while erecting churches on the ruins of temples. To modernize, it appears contradictory, but within the Iberian tradition it was entirely coherent, a seamless fusion of faith and force. Thus, by the time Columbus returned with news of lands across the ocean, Iberia had a class of men primed for conquest. They carried the memory of centuries of holy war, the expectation that land could be seized and redistributed, the conviction that faith justified violence, and the ambition of men who measured themselves by deeds of arms. The Reconquista had ended, but its legacy continued in every decision, every action, and every ambition of the conquistadors who followed. The energies forged in centuries of war at home soon sought outlets across the seas. With the last Muslim kingdom defeated and the crusading impulse still alive, Iberia turned outward. By the late 15th century, the crowns of Portugal and Spain were no longer content with the boundaries of their peninsula. Their gaze stretched beyond the horizon, to Africa, to Asia, and to the still unmapped expanses of the Atlantic. What emerged was not only exploration, but also the bold claim to divide the entire world between them, a claim sanctioned by the papacy and written into treaties that revealed both the audacity and the entitlement of these rising powers. Portugal had moved first. Even while Christian kings in Castile and Aragon still battled for territory within Iberia, the Portuguese had carved their independence and established a monarchy that turned eagerly toward the sea. Under the patronage of Prince Henry, known to later generations as the Navigator, expeditions ventured south along the African coast. Their progress was slow but steady, each cape rounded and each trading station built, representing another step toward the riches of the East. By mid-century they had reached as far as the Gulf of Guinea, opening access to gold, ivory and slaves. Their settlements in Madeira and the Azores demonstrated how Atlantic islands could be transformed into profitable colonies, their soils planted with sugar cane and worked by enslaved labourers. These ventures were not yet empires, but they provided the blueprint for empire, conquest of land, establishment of forts, cultivation of resources, and control of trade. By the time Castile and Aragon unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, Portugal already enjoyed a head start in the maritime race. Portuguese shipbuilders had perfected the caravel. Their navigators combined Arab instruments with European cartographic traditions, and their captains learned to harness the winds of the Atlantic through knowledge of currents and seasonal patterns. They had mastered the Volta du Mar, the wide arc into the open ocean that allowed ships to return north with favourable winds, a discovery that made long voyages feasible. With each success, Portuguese confidence grew, and their ambitions expanded from coastal trade to dominion over routes that reached India and beyond. Spain, fresh from victory in Granada, was eager not to be left behind. The appeal of overseas expansion fit perfectly with the momentum of their recent triumphs. The Catholic monarchs had unified the peninsula under Christian rule, and now sought new arenas in which to extend their power and their faith. Into this atmosphere came Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor with bold ideas about reaching Asia by sailing west. His proposal had been rejected elsewhere, but in Spain he found monarchs willing to gamble. In 1492 he sailed with 3 ships, crossing an ocean wider than he had imagined, and returned with news of islands and peoples previously unknown to Europeans. The implications were immense. Though Columbus himself believed he had reached the fringes of Asia, his discoveries opened the door to lands that would soon become the focus of conquest and colonization. The Portuguese were quick to assert their claims. They argued that earlier treaties already granted them rights to lands discovered south of the Canary Islands. The Treaty of Alcazovas in 1479 had attempted to settle disputes between Portugal and Castile, giving Portugal control of Madeira, the Azores, and rights along the African coast, while Castile retained the Canaries. But Columbus's voyage raised new questions. If the islands he had found were beyond the scope of previous agreements, then whose they were became a pressing issue. Neither crown was willing to let the other seize the advantage. Both monarchies turned to the Pope, whose authority they recognised as binding in such matters. Pope Alexander VI, himself a Spaniard, issued a series of bulls in 1493, granting Spain rights to lands discovered west of a demarcation line drawn 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands. These bulls gave Spain sweeping claims, justified as part of the mission to spread Christianity. Yet Portugal protested. The line was too far east, and it threatened to cut off Portuguese access to routes they had long pursued. Negotiations followed, culminating in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. This treaty shifted the line to a point 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, granting Portugal a larger share of the world. In practical terms, it gave them rights to territories that would later include Brazil, though at the time neither crown fully grasped the implications. The Treaty of Tordesillas was remarkable not only for its audacity but for its assumptions. 2 kingdoms on the edge of Europe presumed to divide the world between them, allocating lands they had not yet seen and peoples they did not know. The rest of Europe had no say, nor did the inhabitants of Africa, Asia, or the Americas. The treaty reflected the mentality of Iberian rulers who saw themselves as heirs to a divine mission. If the Pope sanctioned it, then it was legitimate. If maps could be drawn, then the world could be apportioned like estates after a battle. Such confidence was rooted in centuries of conquest at home, in the crusading spirit of the Reconquista, and in the technological advances that convinced them the world was within their reach. Portugal pursued its share with relentless determination. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to India in 1497 proved that a sea route to Asia was possible. Portuguese fleets soon followed, establishing fortified trading posts along the coasts of Africa, Arabia, and India. Their cannon, mounted on ships, gave them an edge in controlling ports and sea lanes. They carved out a network of strongholds stretching from Lisbon to Goa, from Malacca to Macau, creating the first global maritime empire. Their wealth came not from vast colonies, but from control of spice routes, customs duties, and monopolies enforced by naval power. Spain, constrained by the treaty to look westward, focused on the lands opened by Columbus. At first, these seemed modest compared to the riches of Asia. The islands of the Caribbean offered little in the way of spices or silk. but they provided fertile ground for plantations, and more importantly, they became bases from which Spaniards would launch expeditions into the continents beyond. The treaty ensured that Spain's energies were directed toward the Americas, a fateful redirection that would define the centuries to come. The division of the world also required justification. Iberian rulers and their chroniclers argued that non-Christian lands were available for seizure because their peoples lacked the true faith. The papal bulls granting authority to Spain and Portugal emphasized the duty to convert indigenous populations. Conquest was framed as both a political and a religious act, a continuation of crusade by other means. This ideological framework reassured conquistadors that their actions were not mere greed but part of a divine plan. The blending of faith, violence and entitlement honed in Iberia now expanded to a planetary scale. Yet the reality was often more complex than the neat lines on maps. The line of demarcation was difficult to enforce, and both crowns occasionally tested its limits. Portuguese explorers pushed into Brazil, securing footholds that justified their claim when the land's extent became clear. Spaniards meanwhile pushed farther west than anyone had anticipated, reaching Mexico, Peru, and eventually the Philippines, territories far beyond the original expectations of 1494. The treaty's line, originally drawn with little knowledge, became increasingly impractical as the globe proved larger and more interconnected than Iberian negotiators had assumed. Still, the treaty spirit held. Spain dominated the Americas, Portugal the routes to Asia and the South Atlantic. The treaty also signalled to other European powers that Iberia claimed precedence in overseas expansion. For a time, England, France, and the Netherlands accepted this dominance, lacking the naval capacity to challenge it. But the precedent of two monarchies dividing the world created resentment and provoked future rivals. When northern European states later began their own voyages, they often justified themselves by rejecting papal authority or claiming the Iberians had failed to truly occupy and govern the lands they claimed. Thus, the Treaty of Tordesillas sowed both the foundations of Iberian empires and the seeds of future conflicts. Within Iberia, the division of the world fueled intense activity. In Portugal, kings invested heavily in voyages, financing expeditions that brought back spices and wealth that transformed Lisbon into one of Europe's most vibrant capitals. In Spain, the monarchy oversaw a wave of ventures into the Caribbean, licensing captains to explore, settle and extract wealth. The treaty created a framework in which every discovery could be measured, mapped and claimed. The conquistadors who followed moved within this framework, their ambitions legitimated by royal decrees that rested ultimately on the authority of Tordesillas. For the peoples of the newly encountered lands, the treaty was invisible yet devastating. They knew nothing of the lines drawn in distant Europe, but those lines determined which flag flew over their villages, which language they heard from their conquerors, and which set of colonial policies shaped their fate. Brazil became Portuguese not because of its own choice, but because of an agreement made thousands of miles away. The Caribbean islands became Spanish because papal bulls and treaties said they must. The arrogance of this division was staggering, yet for Iberians of the time it was natural, the culmination of a worldview that assumed their superiority and their right to rule. The division of the world was more than a diplomatic arrangement. It was the moment when Iberian ambitions ceased to be regional and became global. It established a precedent for claiming vast territories with little knowledge, for treating entire continents as estates to be apportioned. It gave conquistadors a framework of legitimacy, however tenuous, and it provided monarchs with the authority to demand loyalty and tribute from distant lands. The warrior tradition of the Reconquista had found a new stage, and the stage was nothing less than the entire world. When the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, the rulers of Iberia believed they had apportioned future discoveries with neat precision, but in truth, the greatest discovery had already taken place. The voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492 had opened an entirely new horizon, one that neither the Portuguese nor the Spanish fully understood at first. Columbus himself had imagined he had reached the outskirts of Asia, islands off the coast of Cathay, or perhaps the Indies described by Marco Polo. What he had actually encountered was a vast continent unknown to Europeans, inhabited by millions of people with societies and traditions as complex as those of Europe itself. Yet to Columbus and his patrons, the significance of the voyage was framed through the lens of Iberian ambition, crusading zeal, and the hunger for wealth and glory. Columbus was not an Iberian by birth. He was Genoese, a sailor shaped by the Mediterranean world of commerce, piracy, and navigation. He had sailed in Portuguese service, gained experience on Atlantic routes, and absorbed the knowledge of mariners who traded along the African coast. By the time he approached the Spanish court, he carried a bold proposal that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. Most scholars of his day doubted the practicality, not because they thought the world was flat, but because they correctly estimated that Asia lay far farther west than Columbus believed. He underestimated the Earth's circumference and overestimated the width of Asia, convincing himself that the journey was feasible. For others it seemed folly, but for Ferdinand and Isabella, newly triumphant in Granada and eager to rival Portugal, it was a gamble worth taking. The voyage itself was modest in scale. 3 small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, crewed by fewer than 100 men, set out from Palos in August of 1492. The crossing was uncertain, the men anxious as days turned to weeks with no sight of land. Columbus reassured them with calculated optimism, sometimes manipulating the distances recorded to prevent panic. At last, on October 12th, they sighted land, an island in the Bahamas that Columbus named San Salvador. He believed he had reached the Indies, and he called the inhabitants Indios, a misnomer that would persist in European usage for centuries. The first encounters between Europeans and the islanders were marked by curiosity and misunderstanding. Columbus noted the generosity and openness of the people he met, remarking that they had little sense of private property and seemed ready to trade whatever they possessed. To him, this signalled both opportunity and vulnerability. He imagined they could be easily converted to Christianity and just as easily subdued if necessary. His diaries reveal a mind that oscillated between admiration and calculation, seeing in the islanders both noble simplicity and exploitable weakness. From the very first moments of contact, the duality of European engagement with the New World was present, a mixture of fascination, condescension, and ambition. The islands themselves offered little of the spices and silks Columbus had hoped to find. What they had instead was fertile soil, forests, and above all gold. Small ornaments worn by the islanders suggested to Columbus that larger sources must exist inland. His expeditions around the Caribbean were driven by this search, as he moved from island to island, naming and claiming them for Spain. Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico became focal points. Columbus established the first European settlement in the Americas on Hispaniola, though it quickly faltered. La Navidad, built from the timbers of the wrecked Santa Maria, was destroyed when relations with the local population soured. Subsequent attempts at settlement faced disease, shortages, and conflicts, but the principle was established. These lands were to be occupied, exploited, and transformed into extensions of Iberian dominion. The Spanish crown rewarded Columbus with titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy of the Indies, and with promises of a share of the wealth he brought back. His return to Spain in 1493 was triumphant, with parades and celebrations hailing his discovery. Yet his fortunes would rise and fall in the years that followed. Subsequent voyages revealed not the riches of Asia, but a vast archipelago of islands whose wealth was uncertain. The settlers who accompanied him expected gold and easy plunder. Instead, they found hard labour, resistance from indigenous communities, and the harsh realities of tropical disease. Discontent grew, and Columbus's governance came under scrutiny. By the time of his 3rd and 4th voyages, he was embroiled in disputes with colonists and the crown, eventually arrested and stripped of his titles. Still, his initial voyage had changed history irrevocably, setting in motion a chain of events that neither he nor his monarchs could have fully predicted. For the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, the arrival of Columbus marked the beginning of catastrophe. Disease spread rapidly, introduced by Europeans and devastating populations with no immunity. The encomienda system, established by Spanish settlers, forced indigenous communities into labour under the guise of protection and Christian instruction. Resistance was met with brutal reprisals, massacres and enslavement. Within decades, the populations of many islands collapsed, reduced by disease, exploitation and violence. Columbus had imagined himself an agent of divine mission, but the legacy of his voyages was devastation for those he encountered. Yet in Spain, the discoveries continued to be framed as triumph. Each voyage returned with new reports of lands, peoples and possibilities. Maps were redrawn, chroniclers recorded the wonders described by sailors, and expectations grew of untold riches waiting to be seized. The Catholic monarchs established administrative systems to oversee these new territories, creating the Casa de Contratación in Seville to regulate trade and navigation. What began as a gamble on one man's flawed calculations became the foundation of a transatlantic empire. The opening of the New World also altered European imaginations. The lands Columbus encountered did not fit neatly into existing frameworks of geography. They were not Asia, though Columbus insisted to his death that he had reached its outskirts. Instead, they were something else entirely, something unimagined in the traditional maps inherited from antiquity. Over time, cartographers and scholars began to speak of a new world, a term that reflected both wonder and disruption. The very existence of these continents challenged European understandings of the world's structure, geography, and even theology. If entire civilizations had existed beyond biblical knowledge, what did that mean for history, for salvation, for the universality of Christian truth? Such questions reverberated through universities and courts, fueling debates that paralleled the practical rush for conquest. Columbus's voyages also intensified competition within Iberia and beyond. The Portuguese, while focused on their routes to India, kept a watchful eye on Spain's westward ventures. Other European powers, initially sidelined, began to consider their own expeditions, though it would take decades before they could challenge Iberian dominance. For Spain, the early decades after Columbus became a period of experimentation, trial and expansion, as conquistadors and settlers pushed outward from the Caribbean in search of lands richer than the islands. The opening of the New World thus transformed the scope of Iberian ambition. No longer confined to the peninsula or even to established trade routes, they now had an entire hemisphere to explore and exploit. The legacy of the Reconquista, the warrior tradition, and the division of the world between Spain and Portugal all converged here. The conquistadors who would soon march into Mexico and Peru were heirs to this moment, carrying with them the assumptions, ambitions and methods first set in motion by Columbus's crossing. The first decades after Columbus's voyage revealed the pattern of Spanish expansion in its rawest form. The islands of the Caribbean became laboratories of conquest, colonization and exploitation, places where the practices that would later be extended across vast continents were first tested and refined. What began as tentative settlements and fragile outposts soon hardened into systems of domination, and at the heart of this transformation was the emergence of the encomienda, a structure that combined the martial traditions of Iberia with the realities of the New World. Hispaniola was the first stage. Columbus returned with settlers eager for wealth, but the reality of the island was not what they expected. Gold was scarce, the labour of mining and agriculture exhausting, and relations with the Taino population quickly deteriorated. The initial wonder of discovery gave way to hunger, disease, and disillusionment. Spanish colonists demanded greater rewards, and Columbus responded with policies that set the tone for years to come. He imposed tributes on indigenous communities, requiring them to deliver gold or other resources at regular intervals. Those who failed faced punishment, including mutilation and death. These measures provoked resistance, and the Taino rose in rebellion, only to be crushed by Spanish weaponry, horses and dogs trained for war. Though vastly outnumbered, the Spaniards leveraged their advantages in arms and tactics, along with the disunity among indigenous groups, to assert control. The conquest of Hispaniola was brutal and swift, but it was also incomplete. Spanish power depended on extracting labour and resources from the very populations they were destroying. Without indigenous labour, the settlements could not sustain themselves. Thus emerged the system of repartimiento, an early form of allocation by which Spaniards were granted the right to receive tribute and labour from specific communities. This system quickly evolved into the encomienda, a more formal arrangement that gave colonists, the encomenderos, rights to the labour and tribute of indigenous people, in return for obligations to protect them and instruct them in Christianity. In practice, it became a system of coerced labour, one that blurred the line between tribute and slavery. The encomienda was rooted in Iberian precedents. During the Reconquista, lands taken from Muslim rulers had been distributed among nobles, monasteries and military orders. Conquered peoples often remained on these lands as labourers or tenants, their tribute redirected to new masters. The idea that conquest legitimised claims to labour was deeply ingrained in Iberian society. In the Caribbean, these traditions were transplanted and adapted to new circumstances. The encomienda allowed the crown to reward conquistadors and settlers without granting them outright ownership of land or people. It maintained the fiction that indigenous communities remained free while binding them to unrelenting labour under colonial control. As more Spaniards arrived, the demand for labour intensified. Gold mining required large numbers of workers, as did the cultivation of crops introduced by Europeans. The encomenderos pressed their charges into service, often under brutal conditions. The promise to instruct them in Christianity was nominal at best, with friars struggling to balance genuine missionary zeal against the cruelty of the system. Some clergy, most famously Bartolomé de las Casas, later denounced the encomienda as unjust and destructive, but in its early years it was seen as indispensable to the survival of the colonies. The impact on indigenous populations was catastrophic. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through communities that had never encountered such diseases. Combined with the violence of conquest, forced labour and social disruption, these epidemics decimated the Taino and other island peoples. Estimates suggest that millions may have lived in the Caribbean before European contact, but within a few decades their numbers had collapsed to a fraction of that. On Hispaniola, entire regions were depopulated, villages abandoned and traditions shattered. Spanish accounts sometimes noted this devastation with regret, but more often it was treated as an unfortunate necessity, a tragic cost of empire. The islands became staging grounds for further expansion. From Hispaniola, Spaniards moved to Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Cuba. Each conquest followed a similar pattern: initial contact, promises of friendship, demands for tribute, rebellion, and suppression. Horses and steel gave Spaniards tactical superiority, while disease weakened indigenous resistance. Leaders such as Hatuey in Cuba became symbols of defiance, resisting Spanish demands and warning others of their cruelty. Hatuey was eventually captured and executed, burned at the stake after rejecting baptism. His story, preserved in chronicles, reflected both the ferocity of resistance and the ruthlessness of Spanish response. Cuba in particular became a crucial base, a launching point for expeditions to the mainland. Its conquest brought new lands for settlement, new indigenous communities to be drawn into encomiendas, and a secure position from which to explore the Yucatan, Mexico, and beyond. By the second decade of the 16th century, the Caribbean was firmly under Spanish control, though the indigenous populations that had sustained its early settlements were in collapse. The birth of the encomienda system also exposed tensions within Spanish society. The crown sought to assert authority over the colonies, ensuring that conquistadors did not become independent lords. By granting encomiendas instead of outright ownership, the monarchy retained theoretical control. Yet in practice, encomenderos often acted with near-total autonomy, extracting as much labour and tribute as they could. Royal officials attempted to regulate the system, issuing laws that limited abuses or restricted inheritance, but enforcement was weak across the ocean. Colonists resisted any attempt to curtail their privileges, insisting that without encomiendas they could not survive. Missionaries increasingly raised their voices in protest. The Dominicans in Hispaniola were among the first to denounce the treatment of indigenous peoples, preaching fiery sermons against the cruelty of encomenderos. Their protests reached Spain, prompting debates at court about the morality and legality of the system. These debates revealed a contradiction at the heart of Spanish expansion: the desire to present conquest as a mission of Christianization and civilization, and the reality of exploitation and devastation. The encomienda embodied this contradiction, simultaneously justified as protection and revealed in practice as oppression. Despite criticism, the system spread. As Spaniards moved into Mexico and Peru, encomiendas were established there as well, becoming central to colonial administration. The Caribbean experience had set the precedent, showing how the fusion of Iberian traditions with the realities of the New World could create structures that endured for centuries. The islands themselves, though soon overshadowed by the wealth of the mainland, remained vital nodes in the imperial network, their ports bustling with ships carrying people, goods, and ideas between Europe and the Americas. The early Caribbean conquest thus served as a crucible. They demonstrated the effectiveness of small bands of Spaniards armed with steel and horses in dominating larger populations. They revealed the devastating impact of disease and coercion. They created the legal and social frameworks of encomienda and tribute that would be replicated on a larger scale, and they accustomed Spaniards to the role of conquerors, settlers, and rulers in lands far from their homeland. The conquistadors who would later march into the heart of empires came of age in these islands, testing their strategies and hardening their resolve in the crucible of the Caribbean. The system of encomiendas also reshaped the lives of the colonists themselves. Some gained wealth and status, building estates and securing influence at court. Others found only hardship, struggling to maintain their claims and fighting constant battles with royal officials, rivals, and indigenous resistance. The promise of riches lured many across the ocean, but the reality was often harsher than expected. Disillusioned settlers sometimes abandoned their holdings, joining new expeditions in search of greater rewards elsewhere. This restlessness ensured a constant stream of volunteers for ventures into unexplored territories, as men sought to escape the limitations of the islands and find opportunities more worthy of their ambitions. For the indigenous peoples, the encomienda was a profound rupture. It disrupted traditional systems of leadership, subordinating caciques to Spanish encomenderos. It demanded labour and tribute in unfamiliar forms, undermining subsistence practices and social structures. It exposed communities to violence, disease, and cultural erosion. Yet even amid devastation, indigenous people resisted in countless ways, fleeing into remote areas, preserving traditions in secret, negotiating with encomenderos for more favourable terms, and sometimes rising in open revolt. The story of the Caribbean was not only one of conquest, but also of survival, adaptation, and resilience, though on terms dictated by the overwhelming force of Spanish colonization. From the islands of the Caribbean, where Spanish settlements struggled with dwindling populations and fragile economies, new horizons beckoned. Rumours circulated of rich lands to the west, of kingdoms with gold and markets larger than any seen before in the Americas. For ambitious men disillusioned with the limitations of Hispaniola and Cuba, these whispers were irresistible. Among them was Hernán Cortés, a minor noble from Extremadura, whose restless ambition and calculating mind would lead him into the heart of one of the most powerful empires of the New World. Cortés was born into a family of hidalgos, minor nobles with more pride than wealth. Like many of his class, he had little inheritance to expect, and few prospects in a society where land and influence were already concentrated in the hands of greater lords. The Reconquista had ended, closing off opportunities for glory at home, and the New World offered the only arena where a man of limited means but great ambition might carve a fortune. Cortés studied briefly in Salamanca, but the university life did not suit him. He sailed instead to Hispaniola, joining the early waves of settlers, and soon moved to Cuba, where Governor Diego Velázquez oversaw the conquest and colonization of the island. There, Cortés gained experience as a colonial administrator, a notary who learned the legal frameworks of conquest even as he cultivated his reputation as a bold and persuasive leader. It was in Cuba that he first heard persistent reports of lands far to the west, richer than anything seen in the Caribbean. Expeditions had already probed the coasts of Yucatan and the Gulf of Mexico, returning with stories of organized cities, impressive temples, and gold ornaments. Velázquez authorized new ventures to explore and possibly establish contact. Cortés maneuvered skillfully, securing command of one such expedition in 1519, though not without arousing Velázquez's suspicion. The governor feared Cortés's ambition and at the last moment tried to revoke his commission. Cortés, however, moved quickly, setting sail before the order could be enforced. His fleet of 11 ships carried some 600 men, a handful of horses and a few cannon, a small force by any measure, yet one that would soon bring down an empire. The voyage across the Yucatan brought first contact with peoples who lived on the fringes of the Aztec sphere of influence. Cortés's expedition captured interpreters who proved invaluable, among them Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Spaniard shipwrecked years earlier and integrated into Maya society, and later Malintzin, known as Doña Marina, a Nahua woman who became Cortés's most trusted translator and advisor. Through them, Cortés gained access not only to language, but also to the political dynamics of the region. He learned of the power of the Mexica, rulers of the Aztec Empire, and of the resentment they inspired among subject peoples forced to pay tribute. This information was the key that allowed Cortés to imagine alliances and strategies that went beyond brute force. His first major confrontation came at Tabasco, where local forces resisted his landing. Spanish steel and horses proved decisive, and after the battle Cortés received gifts of food, slaves, and gold. Among the women given was Malintzin, whose linguistic skills and political acumen soon distinguished her. She spoke Nahuatl and Maya, while Aguilar translated between Spanish and Maya. Through this chain, Cortés could communicate with the peoples of the region, and over time Malintzin learned Spanish herself, eliminating the intermediaries. Her role went beyond language. She understood the rivalries among indigenous groups and helped Cortés navigate alliances, worn of treachery and craft strategies. To the Spaniards she was indispensable. To many indigenous peoples she became a controversial figure, seen by some as a traitor, and by others as a survivor adapting to a shifting world. Cortés established a settlement on the coast, founding Veracruz. This act was more than symbolic. By creating a town with municipal council, he claimed to be acting not under Velázquez's authority, but directly under that of the King of Spain. The council in turn appointed him Captain General, giving him legal cover for his independent actions. This manoeuvre cut ties with Velázquez and ensured that Cortés could justify his enterprise to the crown without interference from Cuba. The foundation of Veracruz also provided a secure base of operations and a channel for communication back to Spain. Before marching inland, Cortés made a dramatic decision to destroy or beach his ships, removing any possibility of retreat. His men understood that their only path was forward, and the act bound them to the enterprise with no escape. This gesture of resolve has been immortalized, though it was as much a calculation as a symbol. Cortés knew that wavering men might attempt to return to Cuba. By eliminating the ships, he ensured that unity and commitment would prevail. The march inland thus began with no turning back. As the expedition moved through the lands of the Gulf Coast, Cortés encountered resistance from the Totonacs, who soon shifted from hostility to alliance when they saw the Spaniards as potential allies against Aztec domination. Tribute collectors from Tenochtitlan arrived demanding the usual payments, and Cortés encouraged defiance, presenting himself as a liberator from Mexica oppression. This pattern repeated as he advanced, with many subject peoples weighing the risks of rebellion against the possibility that Spanish arms and strange weapons could tip the balance of power. The most formidable resistance came from the Tlaxcalans, a confederation fiercely independent and long at odds with the Mexica. Battles between Spaniards and Tlaxcalans were intense, testing the limits of Spanish weapons and endurance. Yet once the Tlaxcalans realized the Spaniards were not invincible, but could be valuable allies, negotiations followed. Cortés skillfully forged an alliance, securing thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors who would march with him against Tenochtitlan. This alliance was crucial. Spanish numbers were small. Without indigenous allies, they could not have hoped to confront the Aztec Empire. The resentment of subject peoples against Mexica tribute and sacrifice was a resource Cortés exploited relentlessly. As the march continued, the Spaniards encountered the grandeur of Mesoamerican civilization. Cities with pyramids and markets astonished them, challenging their assumptions about the so-called savagery of the New World. They saw order, wealth, and culture, yet their eyes remained fixed on gold and opportunity. Cortés presented himself as emissary of a great king, using ceremony and diplomacy alongside threats and displays of force. The mixture of awe and calculation coloured every encounter, as Spaniards sought to interpret unfamiliar customs through the lens of their own ambitions. News of the strangers reached Tenochtitlan quickly. Moctezuma, the emperor of the Mexica, received reports of men with beards, animals resembling deer but used as mounts, and weapons that thundered with smoke and death. His response was cautious, shaped by omens and by the complexities of ruling an empire that balanced fear and tribute. He sent emissaries with gifts, hoping to appease or delay the newcomers. The gold and finery offered to Cortés only fueled Spanish greed, confirming their belief that immense wealth lay at the heart of the empire. The march toward Tenochtitlan was not a straight path, but a series of calculated moves, alliances, and confrontations. Cortés's ability to maneuver politically was as important as his military strength. He exploited divisions among indigenous groups, presented himself as a potential alternative to Mexican dominance, and used the promise of royal favour to attract support. At the same time, he maintained discipline among his men, holding together a force that might otherwise have fractured under the strain of hunger, disease, and uncertainty. When at last the expedition reached the Valley of Mexico, the scale of what they encountered surpassed anything they had imagined. Tenochtitlan rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco, a city of stone and canals, temples and markets, home to hundreds of thousands of people. Its causeways, aqueducts and palaces rivaled or exceeded the great cities of Europe. The Spaniards, hardened by years of war and exploration, were nonetheless astonished. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the conquistadors who later chronicled the events, wrote of their disbelief as though they had entered a dream. Yet beneath the marvel lay calculation, for they saw not only beauty but also opportunity and danger. Cortés's march to Tenochtitlan was thus the culmination of months of strategy, diplomacy, and ruthless resolve. It was not inevitable, but the result of choices, risks, and the exploitation of local grievances. The journey revealed the template of conquest. A small band of Spaniards amplified by alliances with indigenous groups, leveraging superior weaponry and psychological impact, guided by a leader whose ambition and cunning drove them forward. What awaited them in Tenochtitlan would test these methods to their limits, but the march itself had already demonstrated how Iberian traditions of warfare, transplanted into a new world, could achieve astonishing results. When the Spaniards entered Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, they stepped into the heart of one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in the Americas. The Mexica capital stretched across the waters of Lake Texcoco, its causeways linking the island city to the mainland, its temples rising high above the streets, its markets humming with the exchange of goods from across Mesoamerica. The sheer scale of the city overwhelmed the conquistadors. They had seen towns in Cuba and villages in the Yucatan, but nothing on this level of organization and wealth. To them, Tenochtitlan was both a marvel and a prize to be claimed. Moctezuma, the emperor of the Mexica, received the Spaniards with caution and elaborate ceremony. Accounts differ as to his motives. Some sources suggest he believed Cortés might be connected to prophecies of the return of Quetzalcoatl, a god associated with the East. Others argue he was guided less by superstition and more by pragmatic politics, seeking to control the strangers through diplomacy until their intentions became clear. Whatever the reasoning, Moctezuma welcomed Cortés into the city, offering quarters in the palace of his father, Axayacatl. This hospitality gave the Spaniards a foothold in the very centre of imperial power. Cortés, ever calculating, moved quickly to turn the situation to his advantage. He placed Moctezuma under effective house arrest, surrounding him with Spanish guards while maintaining the appearance of respect. Through the emperor, he sought to command the empire using his authority to suppress rebellions and ensure supplies. Moctezuma complied, at least outwardly, but his position eroded rapidly. To his people, the sight of their ruler reduced to a puppet of foreigners was intolerable, undermining his legitimacy and fueling resentment. Tensions simmered as Spaniards pressed their demands. They sought gold above all, and Moctezuma obliged with gifts, but their appetite seemed endless. Cortés ordered idols removed from temples and crosses erected, actions that enraged Mexica priests and horrified the populace. Spanish arrogance clashed with the deeply rooted religious and cultural traditions of the city, creating an atmosphere of mounting hostility. Events elsewhere soon forced Cortés to leave the city. Governor Velázquez of Cuba, still angry at Cortés for defying his authority, had dispatched a force under Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest him. Cortés marched out of Tenochtitlan with part of his army, leaving a garrison under Pedro de Alvarado. He confronted Narváez on the coast, and through a combination of surprise, bribery, and persuasion, managed to defeat him and incorporate his men into his own force. This victory strengthened Cortés, but it left Alvarado in charge in Tenochtitlan at a critical moment. During Cortés's absence, Alvarado had authorized a massacre during the festival of Toxcatl, killing Mexica nobles and priests gathered for ritual celebrations. The act was seen as sacrilege and atrocity, igniting a full-scale uprising. When Cortés returned with reinforcements, he found the city in open revolt. Spaniards were besieged in their quarters, surrounded by angry crowds, cut off from supplies, and harried by relentless attacks. In desperation, Cortés brought Moctezuma before his people, hoping the emperor could calm the fury. Instead, stones and darts were hurled, and Moctezuma was struck, fatally wounded. Whether he was killed by his own people in contempt or by Spaniards when he ceased to be useful remains debated, but his death marked a turning point. The Mexica had lost their ruler, the Spaniards their fragile hold on legitimacy, and the city erupted in chaos. The Spaniards resolved to escape. On the night of June 30th, 1520, they attempted to slip out along the causeways under cover of darkness, laden with gold they tried to carry away. The Mexica discovered them, and in the battles that followed, hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their allies were killed. The causeways became scenes of carnage, men drowning in the lake under the weight of treasure, horses brought down in the water, and chaos engulfing the retreat. This night became known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, a disaster that nearly destroyed the Spanish enterprise. Cortés himself barely escaped, mourning the loss of men, allies, and prestige. Yet the Spaniards were not finished. Retreating to Tlaxcala, they regrouped. Their allies remained loyal, driven by hatred of the Mexica and the hope of breaking free from their dominance. Cortés rebuilt his forces, reorganized his strategy, and prepared for a renewed assault. He ordered the construction of brigantines, small ships that could be carried in pieces to Lake Texcoco and reassembled there, giving the Spaniards control of the waters around Tenochtitlan. The months of preparation turned disaster into opportunity, as Cortés combined Spanish weaponry with vast indigenous support. In 1521, the siege of Tenochtitlan began. Cortés advanced with thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, supported by the brigantines and by artillery. The Mexica, under their new ruler Cuauhtémoc, resisted fiercely. Street by street, canal by canal, the Spaniards and their allies fought their way into the city. The siege lasted for months, during which famine and disease ravaged the population. Smallpox, introduced earlier by a Spanish expedition, spread through the city, killing large numbers and weakening resistance. The combination of hunger, epidemic, and relentless assault gradually wore down the defenders. The final battles were brutal. Houses were destroyed, temples toppled, and the city reduced to ruins. The Mexica fought with desperate courage, but their supplies dwindled and their allies deserted them. Cuauhtémoc, captured as he tried to flee across the lake, was brought before Cortés. The once great city of Tenochtitlan lay in ashes, its causeways littered with the dead, its canals choked with debris. What had been one of the most magnificent cities in the world was transformed into a ruin, a testament to the ferocity of conquest. For the Spaniards, the fall of Tenochtitlan was a triumph unparalleled. With a few hundred men and thousands of indigenous allies, they had brought down an empire. For the Mexica, it was catastrophe, the end of their hegemony and the beginning of subjugation. Yet even in defeat, the memory of their resistance endured, shaping the identity of their descendants for centuries. The conquest of the Aztec Empire revealed the dynamics that defined the age of the conquistadors. Spanish steel, horses and firearms gave them advantages, but these alone could not have secured victory. Alliances with indigenous peoples, divisions within the empire, the spread of European disease, and the relentless ambition of leaders like Cortés all combined to make conquest possible. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not simply a military event, but the collision of worlds, reshaping both Europe and the Americas. In the aftermath, Cortés moved to consolidate control. He laid plans to rebuild the city as Mexico City, the capital of New Spain, and to impose Spanish authority across the region. Encomiendas were established, tribute redirected to new masters, and the structures of colonial rule began to take shape. Missionaries arrived to convert the population, their churches rising on the ruins of temples. The fusion of Iberian traditions with indigenous realities created a new society, neither entirely Spanish nor entirely native, but profoundly transformed by conquest. News of the conquest of Mexico spread quickly across the Caribbean and back to Spain, igniting the imagination of every soldier, settler, and adventurer who heard it. The fall of Tenochtitlan proved that empires thought to be invincible could be undone by small groups of determined men, that alliances with discontented peoples could shatter the power of rulers, and that unimaginable riches might be seized through daring and resolve. Among those who listened most intently was Francisco Pizarro, a man of humble beginnings from Extremadura, the same rugged region that had produced Hernán Cortés. If Mexico could yield treasures beyond measure, then perhaps somewhere farther south lay another empire waiting to be taken. Pizarro's life had prepared him for such ambitions. Born out of wedlock and largely illiterate, he had grown up with little expectation of wealth or status. Extremadura was a harsh land, producing men accustomed to hardship, where opportunities were scarce and many sons of poor nobles or peasants looked outward for fortune. Like Cortés, Pizarro had crossed to the New World in search of better prospects. He had served in the conquest of Hispaniola and later in Panama, where Spanish expeditions carved settlements along the isthmus and began probing the Pacific coast. Pizarro was not distinguished for eloquence or education. but he possessed qualities of endurance, determination, and shrewdness. He had learned to survive in difficult conditions, to lead small bands of men through jungles and across mountains, and to calculate when patience or audacity would serve him best. In Panama, Pizarro allied himself with two men whose fortunes became intertwined with his own: Diego de Almagro, a soldier and adventurer, and Hernando de Luque, a priest and financier. Together they formed a partnership, agreeing to explore the lands rumoured to lie to the south. Stories had circulated among coastal traders and indigenous informants of rich kingdoms beyond the equator, places where gold and silver flowed in abundance and rulers commanded vast armies. To Spaniards who had seen the wealth of Mexico, these tales were compelling. If another empire existed, it could provide not only riches but also the kind of glory that secured titles, estates, and immortality in chronicles. The first expeditions were modest and uncertain. Pizarro led small groups southward along the Pacific coast, encountering hostile environments and limited supplies. The jungles and swamps of what is now Colombia tested their endurance. Hunger, disease, and conflict with local populations nearly destroyed them. Almagro, tasked with securing reinforcements and supplies, lost an eye in skirmishes but persisted in supporting the venture. These early failures did not deter them. Instead, they fueled the convictions that greater prizes lay just beyond reach. The key was to push farther, to endure hardship until the rumoured kingdom was found. It was during these explorations that Spaniards first glimpsed evidence of the Inca Empire. Coastal peoples spoke of powerful rulers in the highlands, of armies disciplined and formidable, of roads that stretched for hundreds of miles, and of wealth measured not in ornaments but in mountains of silver and gold. Traders carried finely worked textiles and objects of metal that confirmed the tales. For Pizarro and his companions, this was the sign they had awaited. Unlike the scattered chiefdoms of the Caribbean or the smaller polities of Central America, here was an empire on a scale comparable to Mexico, perhaps even greater. Yet reaching it was no simple matter. The distance from Panama was immense, and supplies could not easily be maintained across such terrain. The Spanish crown, wary after years of unauthorized ventures, demanded proof before granting rights to conquer new lands. Pizarro knew he needed royal support if he was to succeed. After further expeditions brought back more convincing evidence of Inca wealth, he resolved to return to Spain and petition directly for authority. In 1529, Pizarro crossed the Atlantic carrying with him samples of gold, silver, and textiles taken from the coasts of South America. His timing was favourable. The conquest of Mexico had made the Spanish court receptive to further enterprises, and Pizarro presented himself as the man capable of repeating Cortés' success. Despite his humble background, his persistence and the tangible proof of riches convinced the crown. Charles V granted him the capitulation of Toledo, a royal license authorizing him to conquer and govern the lands of Peru. He was named governor and captain general of the territories he might bring under Spanish control, though the exact boundaries were left vague. This grant secured his position, but also sowed seeds of conflict, for his partners Almagro and Luque received lesser titles, creating tensions that would later erupt into open rivalry. Returning to Panama with royal backing, Pizarro prepared for the great expedition. The challenges were immense, the distances vast, the terrain formidable, and the Inca Empire far stronger than any foe yet faced. Yet fortune intervened in ways he could not have foreseen. By the early 1530s, the Inca realm was convulsed by civil war. The death of the Emperor Huayna Capac, likely from a European disease that had travelled ahead of the Spaniards, left the empire divided between his sons Huáscar and Atahualpa. Their struggle for supremacy devastated the empire, consuming armies and undermining unity. When Pizarro landed on the coast, he encountered a realm weakened by internal strife, its people exhausted, and its legitimacy fractured. Pizarro advanced cautiously at first, establishing contact with coastal peoples and gathering intelligence. He built alliances where possible, using gifts and promises to secure support. His small band of Spaniards, fewer than 200 men with a handful of horses and cannon, seemed insignificant compared to the might of the Inca armies. Yet Pizarro, like Cortés before him, understood that numbers alone did not decide outcomes. Strategy, surprise, and the exploitation of division could overturn empires. He resolved to march inland, to confront the Sapa Inca directly, and to seize the initiative before his presence could be crushed. The march into the Andes was an ordeal. The Spaniards and their horses struggled with steep passes, thin air, and unfamiliar climates. Yet the roads they travelled astonished them. The Inca highway system, paved and maintained across mountains and valleys, revealed an empire of extraordinary organisation. Storehouses filled with food and supplies testified to administrative efficiency. Bridges spanned rivers, and relay runners carried messages across vast distances with remarkable speed. The Spaniards recognised that they faced a foe not of scattered tribes, but of a centralised and disciplined state, one whose resources dwarfed anything they had yet seen. As they advanced, they heard of Atahualpa's victory over his brother Huáscar. The civil war had ended with Atahualpa triumphant, but the wounds it left were fresh. Many within the empire resented his rule, while others remained loyal to the defeated Huáscar. Pizarro saw in this division the same opportunity Cortés had exploited in Mexico. Discontented factions could become allies, while the emperor's position was less secure than his army suggested. When the Spaniards reached Cajamarca in 1532, they arranged a meeting with Atahualpa. The encounter would decide the fate of the empire. Pizarro, outnumbered beyond reckoning, devised a plan that combined audacity with ruthlessness. He invited Atahualpa to meet within the town, promising friendship and alliance. The Inca ruler arrived with thousands of attendants, unarmed but confident, for he believed these strangers posed no real threat. The Spaniards concealed their men and artillery, waiting for the signal. What followed became one of the most shocking moments of the conquest. A friar presented Atahualpa with a Bible, urging him to embrace Christianity and recognize the authority of the Spanish king. Accounts differ, but Atahualpa either discarded or misunderstood the object, provoking outrage. At Pizarro's signal, cannons fired, cavalry charged, and Spaniards attacked the unarmed crowd. Panic and slaughter ensued as the Inca retinue, unprepared for such treachery, fell into chaos. Atahualpa himself was seized in the confusion, dragged into captivity while thousands of his attendants were killed. The capture of Atahualpa was the decisive stroke. With the emperor in their hands, the Spaniards controlled the empire despite their small numbers. Atahualpa attempted to secure his release by offering a ransom of staggering proportions, a room filled with gold and twice with silver. For months, treasures were brought from across the empire, melted down into ingots, and divided among the Spaniards. The scale of wealth astonished Europe when it was later shipped back, confirming the allure of Peru. Yet despite the ransom, Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. Fearing his influence and the potential for rebellion, the Spaniards staged a trial on charges of idolatry and treason, condemning him to death. Strangled after agreeing to baptism, Atahualpa's death marked the end of Inca sovereignty, though resistance continued for years. The road to Peru had thus culminated in conquest, achieved not by overwhelming force, but by deception, audacity, and the exploitation of divisions. Pizarro had followed a path similar to Cortés, adapting Iberian traditions of warfare and governance to the realities of the New World. The capture of Atahualpa and the seizure of his empire would reshape not only the Andes, but also the entire Spanish monarchy, flooding Europe with wealth and transforming global trade. Yet for the peoples of Peru, it marked the beginning of a new order built on subjugation, labour, and the imposition of foreign rule. The seizure of Atahualpa at Cajamarca was both shocking and decisive, the moment when a small band of Spaniards turned the fate of an empire through audacity and treachery. To the Inca world, the capture of the Sapa Inca was an event of cosmic magnitude. The ruler was not only a political leader, but the living representative of the sun god Inti, the axis of their state and society. For him to fall into the hands of strangers was inconceivable, a rupture in the natural order that left the empire shaken, uncertain, and vulnerable. To Francisco Pizarro and his companions, the emperor was not only a hostage but the key to unlocking the wealth of Peru, the means by which they could control vast territories with a force smaller than a single Inca regiment. Atahualpa had come to Cajamarca in triumph, fresh from victory over his brother Huáscar, whose supporters still lingered in rebellion. He commanded tens of thousands of troops encamped nearby, veterans of civil war hardened by years of fighting. Yet when he entered Cajamarca, he brought only attendants, confident that his power was unassailable. The Spaniards, fewer than 200 men with a handful of horses and cannon, should have posed no threat. But their sudden attack, the thunder of their guns, the charge of armoured cavalry into unarmed crowds, and the chaos of fire and steel shattered the calm. Atahualpa was seized amid the slaughter, dragged away by men who recognized the value of a living ruler. His army, stunned and leaderless, dissolved into confusion, unwilling to act without his command. The Spaniards had performed what seemed impossible. They had decapitated the empire without killing its head. The days that followed revealed the delicate balance of power. Atahualpa remained in captivity, treated with outward respect, yet held firmly under guard. Pizarro and his men understood that as long as he was alive, the empire might be governed through him. Orders issued in his name still carried weight, supplies were still provided, and many local lords still hesitated to rebel. Atahualpa, recognizing his predicament, sought to secure his freedom through negotiation. He promised a ransom beyond imagination, a room filled with gold to the height of a man's reach, and 2 rooms of silver of equal measure. To the Spaniards this was irresistible. They agreed, and the machinery of the empire began to move, treasures collected from across the Andes and brought to Cajamarca. The ransom transformed the small town into a repository of unimaginable wealth. Golden vessels, finely worked ornaments, silver plates, and sacred objects from temples were gathered, stripped and melted down into ingots for division among the Spaniards. The process took months, during which time the conquistadors waited impatiently, quarrelling over shares and dreaming of estates and titles in Spain. The sheer scale of the treasure confirmed every rumour that had drawn them southward. Yet for the Inca people it was an act of sacrilege. Sacred objects, symbols of divine power, were desecrated and destroyed, their meaning erased in the fires of Spanish furnaces. Atahualpa used this time to manoeuvre as best he could. He maintained correspondence with his generals, attempted to consolidate his authority, and perhaps considered how to rally his forces once free. Some accounts suggest he ordered the execution of his brother Huáscar, fearing that the Spaniards might use him as a rival claimant to the throne. Others portray him as outwardly compliant, masking his calculations behind a facade of calm. To Pizarro and his men, however, the longer Atahualpa lived, the greater the risk that his supporters might regroup and attack. Once the ransom was delivered, the incentive to keep him alive diminished. The trial that followed was a travesty of justice, designed less to determine guilt than to provide a pretext for execution. Atahualpa was accused of idolatry, polygamy, and plotting against the Spaniards, charges that reflected Spanish cultural prejudices more than actual crimes. He was convicted swiftly, and the sentence was death by burning at the stake, a punishment intended both to eliminate him and to terrify his subjects. At the last moment he agreed to baptism, taking the Christian name Francisco, and in return his sentence was commuted to death by strangulation. On the night of his execution in August 1533, the Sapa Inca, once master of a realm that stretched for thousands of miles, was put to death by a handful of foreigners. His execution sent shockwaves through the empire. The divine ruler was gone, and with him the coherence of Inca authority. Nobles and generals were left to scramble for power, some seeking to claim legitimacy, others resisting the Spaniards outright. Yet the empire's vastness and complexity now worked against it. Without a central figure to unite its provinces, fragmentation accelerated. Some regions submitted to Spanish rule, hoping to preserve privileges under new masters. Others resisted, but without coordination, their uprisings were crushed piecemeal. The Spaniards, emboldened by their success, marched on Cusco, the heart of the empire. With native allies and the aura of invincibility conferred by Atahualpa's capture, they entered the city in late 1533. Cusco, the sacred centre of Inca power, was plundered and occupied, its temples stripped, its palaces seized. From this symbolic conquest, the Spaniards declared themselves masters of Peru. Even as resistance simmered in the highlands, they installed a puppet Inca ruler, Manco Inca, hoping to govern through him as they had through Atahualpa. But the arrangement soon collapsed into rebellion. Manco Inca initially cooperated, but Spanish abuses and arrogance drove him to revolt. In 1536 he launched a massive uprising, surrounding Cusco with tens of thousands of warriors. For months the Spaniards were besieged, reduced to desperate defence. Yet once again, steel, cavalry and the support of rival indigenous groups turned the tide. The siege failed, and Manco retreated to Vilcabamba, where he established a neo-Inca state that persisted for decades in resistance. The collapse of the Inca Empire was thus not a single event, but a process of disintegration, shaped by the death of Atahualpa, the occupation of Cuzco, and the waves of rebellion that followed. Spanish success depended not only on military force, but on the willingness of indigenous rivals to ally with them, on the devastating impact of European diseases that ravaged populations, and on the internal fractures left by civil war. The once unified empire, with its roads, armies, and bureaucracy, dissolved into a patchwork of Spanish settlements, encomiendas, and indigenous polities negotiating survival under new conditions. For the Spaniards, the collapse unleashed torrents of wealth. Silver mines in Potosi and other regions soon poured out riches that transformed the Spanish monarchy and the European economy. For the Andean peoples, it marked the beginning of a new order defined by forced labour, religious conversion, and the erosion of traditional structures. Yet resistance never entirely ceased. From Vilcabamba to remote highland communities, echoes of defiance persisted, ensuring that the conquest was never as absolute as Spaniards claimed. The capture of Atahualpa at Cajamarca and the subsequent collapse of the Inca Empire mirrored in many ways the conquest of Mexico, yet it also revealed unique features. The Andes presented challenges of terrain and communication, unlike those of Mesoamerica. The Inca system of centralized authority, so effective in its prime, became a vulnerability once the emperor was removed. The Spaniards, adept at exploiting division and projecting power through spectacle and fear, capitalized on these vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency. In the process, they transformed themselves from adventurers into rulers, from intruders into masters of a realm that stretched for thousands of miles. But the conquest was not only a clash of arms, it was a collision of worldviews, of cosmologies and expectations. For the Inca, the capture of their ruler threatened the very fabric of existence. For how could the sun's representative be subjected to foreign power? For the Spaniards, it was proof of divine favour, confirmation that their mission was blessed and their risks rewarded. The narratives constructed afterward reinforced these interpretations, with Spanish chroniclers emphasizing the justice of their cause and indigenous accounts mourning the catastrophe that had befallen them. In this crucible of conquest, the patterns of Spanish colonization were further entrenched. Encomiendas were granted, indigenous labour mobilized, and the fusion of Iberian and Andean societies began, often violently, through intermarriage, conversion, and coercion. The collapse of the Inca world was not an end, but the beginning of a transformation. that would reshape the Andes for centuries, leaving legacies still visible in language, culture, and memory. The fall of the Inca Empire did not mark the end of conquest, but rather the opening of new frontiers. The Spaniards who had followed Pizarro into the Andes, enriched by ransom and emboldened by victory, quickly turned their ambitions outward. To them, the vastness of South America promised opportunities as great or greater than those already seized. The Andes were only one axis of a continent that stretched from tropical forests to arid deserts and windswept plains. The promise of new kingdoms, new riches, and new dominions compelled conquistadors to push farther, probing into Chile, Colombia, and the Rio de la Plata, each expedition a test of endurance, luck, and the fragile bonds between Spaniards and their indigenous allies. In the wake of Atahualpa's death and the capture of Cusco, rivalries among the Spaniards themselves shaped the direction of expansion. Diego de Almagro, longtime partner and rival of Francisco Pizarro, pressed for a share of the spoils equal to what he believed was his due. The capitulación granted to Pizarro by the crown had elevated him above Almagro, sowing bitterness. To resolve disputes and to satisfy ambition, Almagro was granted rights to explore and govern the lands south of Peru. It was under this authority that he embarked on the expedition into Chile, a venture that revealed both the allure and the perils of conquest beyond the Inca heartland. Almagro's march to Chile began with high expectations. Reports of fertile valleys and rich lands had reached Cusco, and Almagro imagined he might find another empire to rival the Mexica or the Inca. In 1535 he led a force of Spaniards and thousands of indigenous auxiliaries through the deserts of southern Peru and across the high Andes. The journey was grueling. The desert offered little water, the mountains inflicted freezing cold, and men and animals perished in large numbers. The sheer scale of the Andes humbled even the most seasoned conquistadors, reminding them that the landscape itself could be a foe as deadly as any army. When they finally descended into Chile, the reality was far from the golden visions that had inspired the expedition. The land was fertile in parts but offered no great concentrations of wealth. The peoples they encountered, later known as the Mapuche, resisted fiercely, fighting with skill and determination. They did not possess the centralized structures that had made the Mexica and Inca vulnerable to sudden decapitation. Instead, they relied on local leaders and a tradition of resilient resistance. Almagro's men found little gold and constant hostility. Exhausted and disillusioned, the expedition turned back. The march had drained resources and morale, leaving Almagro embittered. His failure in Chile deepened the rift with Pizarro, leading eventually to open conflict between their factions in Peru, a civil war among conquistadors that mirrored in miniature the divisions they had exploited among the indigenous. Yet Chile was not abandoned. Later expeditions, most famously under Pedro de Valdivia, returned in the 1540s, establishing Santiago and laying the foundations of Spanish presence there. Valdivia, a veteran of Pizarro's campaigns, pushed deep into the central valleys, but his efforts met the same pattern of fierce resistance. The Mapuche, unlike many other peoples, refused to submit, engaging in decades of conflict that became known as the Arauco War. Spanish settlements clung to survival, often besieged and burned, while the frontier shifted back and forth. Chile became a land of struggle rather than easy conquest, shaping its colonial history in ways distinct from Mexico or Peru. While Almagro pressed south, other Spaniards turned northward toward the lands that would become Colombia. Explorers moving out from the Caribbean coast had already probed the Magdalena River Valley and the highlands beyond, but it was the expeditions of the 1530s and 1540s that secured Spanish footholds. Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada led one of the most significant ventures, marching inland from Santa Marta with hundreds of men. The journey through tropical forests and swamps was disastrous. Disease, hunger, and constant hardship decimated the force, leaving only a fraction alive by the time they reached the high plateau of the Bogotá savanna. Yet what they found astonished them. The Muisca people, organised societies with markets, gold ornaments, and traditions of offering treasure to their gods. The Spaniards interpreted these practices through the lens of legend. Tales circulated of a golden man, a ruler covered in gold dust who bathed in a sacred lake. This story, perhaps a misunderstanding of Muisca rituals at Lake Guatavita, grew into the legend of El Dorado, the Gilded One, a kingdom of gold hidden in the interior. For Quesada and his men, the reality of the Muisca already offered wealth, but the legend promised even more. Conquest of the Bogotá Plateau brought Spanish settlements and the founding of Bogotá itself, but it also launched centuries of futile expeditions deeper into jungles and mountains in search of a city of gold that never existed. The obsession with El Dorado drew countless adventurers to their deaths, consuming fortunes and lives in pursuit of a myth born of mistranslation and hope. The conquest of Colombia was not the work of Quesada alone. Other expeditions, led by Nicolas Federman from Venezuela and Sebastián de Belalcázar from Quito, converged on the same region, each claiming priority. Their simultaneous arrival created disputes and rivalries, echoing the broader pattern of Spanish expansion, where overlapping licenses and ambitions led to conflict. Negotiations and appeals to the crown were required to settle these disputes, but in practice, the victors were those who could hold territory and establish towns. Colombia became a patchwork of Spanish settlements, each founded in blood and labour, tied together more by the drive for gold than by coherent planning. Even farther afield, Spaniards pushed into the Rio de la Plata region at the southern cone of the continent. Early ventures here were marked by extraordinary hardship. Pedro de Mendoza, granted the right to colonize the area, led a large expedition in 1536 that attempted to found Buenos Aires. The site, chosen on the estuary where the Paraná and Uruguay rivers meet, seemed promising, but supplies quickly ran out and relations with local peoples turned hostile. The settlement teetered on collapse, besieged and starving, until survivors abandoned it and retreated upriver. Only decades later would Buenos Aires be successfully re-established, but the early failure underscored the difficulties of sustaining colonies in regions without immediate sources of precious metals. The Rio de la Plata expeditions highlighted another dynamic of Spanish expansion, the tension between visions of vast conquest and the practical realities of geography. Unlike Mexico and Peru, the southern cone offered no concentrated empires or stores of gold ready to be seized. The riches of the region lay instead in land, livestock and agriculture, which took time to develop and lacked the immediate allure of bullion. Many conquistadors, impatient for quick fortunes, abandoned the Rio de la Plata to join ventures elsewhere. Those who remained carved out more modest settlements, laying the groundwork for colonial economies based on cattle and trade rather than sudden windfalls of treasure. These expeditions beyond Peru revealed both the strengths and the limitations of the conquistador model. Spaniards were able to project power across immense distances, leveraging small forces with horses, steel and firearms to intimidate and defeat larger indigenous groups. They exploited divisions, forged alliances, and imposed systems of tribute and labour wherever they gained footholds. Yet their successes depended heavily on circumstance. Where centralised empires existed, conquest could be swift, but where societies were more decentralised and resistant, as in Chile, or where wealth was diffuse, as in the Rio de la Plata, Spaniards found themselves mired in wars of attrition and fragile colonies. The pattern of rivalry among Spaniards themselves also continued. The disputes between Pizarro and Almagro escalated after the failure in Chile, culminating in Almagro's capture and execution in 1538. This internecine conflict did not end the hunger for new ventures, but showed how fragile unity was among conquistadors. Each sought personal glory and wealth, and alliances shifted quickly in pursuit of advantage. The crown in Spain attempted to assert greater control, sending officials to regulate territories and curb the ambitions of individual conquerors. But across the ocean, distance made enforcement weak. The Americas remained arenas where bold men could carve out fortunes, often at the expense of both indigenous peoples and rival Spaniards. The legends that grew from these expeditions, El Dorado in Colombia, the Mapuche Wars in Chile, the harsh beginnings of Buenos Aires, entered the lore of conquest, inspiring future generations to continue pushing into the continent's interior. Even when ventures ended in disaster, survivors returned with stories that fueled the imagination of others. The notion that just beyond the next mountain range or across the next river lay a kingdom of wealth never ceased to draw adventurers into peril. For indigenous peoples, the arrival of Spaniards brought upheaval on every frontier. In Chile, villages were burned and populations enslaved or forced into encomiendas, sparking cycles of rebellion and reprisal that lasted centuries. In Colombia, Muisca rituals were disrupted, sacred lakes desecrated in the search for gold, and societies reorganized under Spanish demands for tribute. In the Rio de la Plata, communities confronted the loss of land and the violence of early settlements, even as colonists struggled to survive. Each region experienced conquest differently, shaped by its own geography, societies and traditions, yet all were drawn into the orbit of Spanish Empire. The expansion beyond Peru thus demonstrated that the conquests were not isolated events, but a rolling tide, each success feeding ambition for the next, each failure instructing new strategies. From the deserts of Chile to the highlands of Colombia and the plains of the Rio de la Plata, conquistadors sought to replicate the triumphs of Cortés and Pizarro, often finding instead the harsh realities of resistance, scarcity and rivalry. Yet even when they failed to find empires of gold, they laid the foundations of colonial rule, embedding Spanish presence across South America. While Mexico and Peru dazzled the Spanish imagination with their spectacular riches and centralized empires, the northern lands presented a different kind of challenge, one that would expose the limits of conquistador ambition. Men who had grown wealthy or famous in the Caribbean, Mexico or the Andes looked to the vast stretches of what is now the southern United States, with the same hunger for gold and glory. Yet what they found there was not another Tenochtitlan or Cusco, but sprawling forests, rivers, swamps and societies that resisted incorporation into Spanish models of conquest. The expeditions of Pánfilo de Narváez and Hernando de Soto stand as examples of how the conquistador method, so successful in Mesoamerica and the Andes, could falter when confronted with different landscapes and decentralized societies. Narváez was a veteran of earlier conquests. He had sailed with Diego Velázquez in Cuba, had attempted to assert authority over Hernán Cortés in Mexico, and had seen firsthand how rivalries among Spaniards could be as dangerous as battles with indigenous peoples. By the late 1520s, he secured royal backing to explore and settle the lands of Florida, which had been sighted but not colonized during earlier voyages. The license he obtained granted him vast authority over regions barely known, promising him dominion if he could secure them. In 1527, he assembled an expedition of several hundred men and set out, confident that Florida would yield riches comparable to Mexico. From the beginning, Narváez's venture was plagued with misfortune. Storms scattered his fleet as it crossed the Caribbean, supplies dwindled, and confusion reigned as to where exactly they had landed. When the expedition came ashore near Tampa Bay in 1528, they encountered complex indigenous societies who offered neither submission nor gold. Narváez divided his forces, sending ships ahead while leading men overland, a decision that left both groups isolated and vulnerable. Marching through swamps and forests, the Spaniards faced constant hunger, attacks from local warriors, and illnesses born of unfamiliar climates. They expected to find cities of wealth. Instead, they stumbled through wilderness, sustained only by hope and desperation. The climax of disaster came when Narváez ordered the construction of crude rafts to sail along the Gulf Coast in search of Spanish settlements. The rafts were poorly built, supplies nearly exhausted, and storms tore them apart. Most of the expedition perished, including Narváez himself, swept away and never seen again. Only a handful of survivors, including Alva Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, managed to reach the coast of Texas. From there, over the course of years, they wandered across the continent, enduring enslavement, hunger, and extraordinary hardship, until they eventually reached Spanish settlements in Mexico in the 1530s. Their accounts of vast lands, numerous peoples, and strange customs provided valuable knowledge, but also revealed the futility of Narvaez's grand ambitions. Instead of conquest, the expedition became a story of survival against overwhelming odds. Cabeza de Vaca's narrative, published later in Spain, captivated audiences with its tales of endurance and encounters with countless indigenous groups. He described societies far different from those of Mexico or Peru, decentralized, mobile, and diverse, stretching across immense landscapes that seemed endless. His writings fed new legends, including rumours of wealthy cities farther north, the 7 cities of Cibola, but they also underscored how ill-suited Spanish expectations were to the realities of North America. Narvaez's failure became a cautionary tale, yet it did not deter others from trying. Hernando de Soto embodied the next wave of ambition. A veteran of the conquest of Peru, he had enriched himself during the capture of Atahualpa and imagined he might repeat such success in new lands. Awarded a royal license in 1537 to explore and govern La Florida, his expedition was one of the largest mounted in North America, consisting of hundreds of men, dozens of horses, priests, artisans, and enslaved Africans. De Soto envisioned himself as a second Cortés or Pizarro, expecting to find powerful rulers and treasures ripe for the taking. Landing in Florida in 1539, De Soto's force began a march that would take them across much of the southeastern United States, from the swamps of Florida through Georgia and the Carolinas into Tennessee and Alabama, and eventually to the Mississippi River. The journey covered thousands of miles, a wandering odyssey through forests, rivers, and plains that confounded Spanish hopes. Instead of empires with central capitals, they encountered a mosaic of chiefdoms, some large and organized, others smaller and mobile. The Mississippian cultures they met had towns and ceremonial centers, but none offered the kind of concentrated wealth or tribute that the Spaniards demanded. From the start, relations were tense. De Soto demanded food, porters, and women from each community he encountered, often taking hostages or burning villages when cooperation was not forthcoming. Indigenous resistance grew fierce, and battles erupted across the journey. At Mobile in Alabama in 1540, De Soto's force clashed with warriors under Chief Tuscaloosa in a brutal battle that left thousands of indigenous people dead and the town destroyed. The Spaniards suffered heavy losses as well, their hopes of quick conquest slipping further away. Despite such clashes, De Soto pressed on. Convinced that wealth lay just beyond the horizon, his men endured starvation, disease, and exhaustion, driven by promises of riches that never materialized. In 1541, they reached the Mississippi River, a natural barrier of immense scale. Crossing it with makeshift rafts, they marveled at its size, one of the great rivers of the world, but found little of the gold they craved. Instead, they encountered more resistance, more hardship, and no empire to seize. De Soto himself died in 1542 on the banks of the Mississippi, likely from fever. His followers, fearful that news of his death would embolden indigenous resistance, secretly buried him in the river. Leaderless and desperate, the survivors built rafts and drifted downriver to the Gulf of Mexico, eventually reaching Spanish settlements in Mexico. Of the hundreds who had begun the expedition, only a fraction survived. The grand vision of another Peru or Mexico in the north dissolved into a grim tale of attrition and futility. The failure of Narvaez and De Soto underscored the limitations of the conquistador model when transposed onto regions without centralized states. The Spaniards had succeeded in Mexico and Peru by capturing rulers and exploiting tribute systems. But in North America, power was more diffuse, wealth less concentrated, and geography more challenging. Their methods of coercion bred hostility rather than submission, and their reliance on extracting resources from local populations proved unsustainable. The land was vast, the people resilient, and the hoped for treasures non-existent. Yet these failures did not extinguish Spanish interest. Instead, they reshaped it. North America became less a target for immediate conquest of empires, and more a frontier for missions, small settlements, and long-term colonization. The legends of Cibola and Quivira, fueled by survivors' tales, spurred later expeditions deeper into the southwest. But the grand dreams of Narvaez and de Soto, of conquering another empire in a single stroke, remained unfulfilled. The stories of these expeditions circulated widely in Spain and the colonies, serving both as warnings and as inspiration. They revealed the extraordinary scale of the continent, the diversity of its peoples, and the dangers of overconfidence. They also highlighted the adaptability and endurance of indigenous societies, which could resist Spanish intrusion through mobility, alliances, and knowledge of their lands. In the broader narrative of conquest, the failed ventures of Narvaez and de Soto stand as reminders that Spanish success was never inevitable, that it depended on particular conditions that did not exist everywhere. For the conquistadors themselves, these failures were devastating. Narvaez vanished without glory. His expedition remembered more for Cabeza de Vaca's survival than for any conquest. De Soto, who had dreamed of crowns and titles, died anonymously in a foreign land, his body consigned to a river he could not claim. Their men, who had endured years of suffering, returned with little to show but scars and memories. Yet even in failure, their journeys expanded European knowledge of the continent, mapping rivers, mountains, and peoples that had been unknown to Spain. In the long arc of history, the attempts of Narvaez and de Soto foreshadowed the different trajectory of North America compared to Mexico and Peru. Here, conquest would not come through sudden coups against centralized rulers, but through slower processes of settlement, missionization, and gradual encroachment. The conquistadors' model of swift domination found its limits, and the Spaniards who followed had to adapt to new realities of colonization. The failures of Narvaez and de Soto did not diminish the conquistador appetite for discovery. If anything, they fueled a deeper hunger for legends of wealth that seemed just out of reach. Whenever survivors returned with tales of distant lands, Europeans filtered those reports through their own expectations, exaggerating them into stories of hidden cities and golden kings. Nowhere did this process take firmer hold than in the legend of El Dorado, a name that would come to symbolize the insatiable quest for riches, even when the object itself proved elusive or entirely illusory. The seeds of the legend were planted in the highlands of present-day Colombia. When Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada marched inland from the Caribbean coast and reached the Bogotá Plateau in the 1530s, he encountered the Misca people. Their society was organized into powerful chiefdoms, with markets, temples, and finely worked ornaments of gold. To the Spaniards, who equated wealth with bullion, this sight of so much metal confirmed that they had reached a land of promise. Yet the Misca used gold not as currency, but as sacred adornment, offerings to their gods. The Spaniards misunderstood rituals, particularly those associated with Lake Guatavita, where local traditions spoke of ceremonies in which rulers were covered in gold dust and immersed in the waters as offerings were cast into the depths. To European ears, this became the story of a gilded man, El Dorado, a king or kingdom of unimaginable wealth waiting to be discovered. Once the tale spread, it took on a life of its own. Each expedition that set out in search of El Dorado shifted the location of the Golden Kingdom farther away, always beyond the last mountain range or across the next river. The legend was elastic, adapting to failures by placing the goal perpetually out of reach. Conquistadors who had tasted the spoils of Mexico or Peru convinced themselves that another such empire must exist, and El Dorado became the name they gave to that hope. Among the first to chase the vision was Sebastián de Belalcázar, who had marched with Pizarro in Peru and later moved northward into what is now Ecuador and Colombia. He heard the stories of Guatavita and believed that somewhere in the interior lay the true seat of golden power. His ventures deepened Spanish penetration into the Andes but produced no kingdom of riches. Yet instead of extinguishing the dream, each disappointment only shifted its location. Soon, attention turned eastward, into the vast and poorly known lowlands beyond the Andes, where rivers like the Orinoco and Amazon flowed into lands as mysterious as they were forbidding. The lure of El Dorado drew not only Spaniards but also other Europeans. The legend was too powerful to remain confined to one empire. Germans, through the Welser banking family of Augsburg, had been granted rights to explore parts of Venezuela, and they too pursued the Golden Kingdom. Nicholas Federmann ventured into the interior, clashing and competing with Spanish captains, only to return empty-handed. Others tried their fortunes, each hoping to succeed where rivals had failed, each leaving behind stories that expanded the geography of El Dorado, even as they failed to fix it on a map. The Orinoco Basin became one of the focal points of the search. Its immense rivers and labyrinthine tributaries seemed to promise hidden civilizations. In the 1560s and beyond, expeditions plunged into its jungles, enduring hunger, disease, and attacks from indigenous groups who resisted intrusion. Juan Martín de Albujar and later Antonio de Berrio launched repeated attempts, convinced that El Dorado lay somewhere near the headwaters. Berrio in particular devoted decades of his life to the quest, squandering fortunes and lives in expeditions that produced little more than suffering. His determination, however, kept the legend alive, ensuring that new waves of adventurers would follow. The most famous chronicler of El Dorado was Sir Walter Raleigh, the English courtier and explorer who in 1595 sailed to Guyana and ascended the Orinoco in search of the Golden City. His published account, The Discovery of Guiana, described a land rich in resources and hinted at Manoa, a fabled city of gold supposedly situated near Lake Perim. Raleigh's prose captured the imagination of Europe, even though his descriptions were based more on rumour than observation. He spoke of golden statues, paved streets, and treasures rivaling those of Peru, though no evidence supported these claims. For England, competing with Spain, the story of El Dorado offered not only the lure of wealth, but also the possibility of striking a blow against Spanish power. Raleigh's failure did not diminish the legend. If anything, his words magnified it, ensuring its survival for centuries as one of the great myths of exploration. The search for phantom kingdoms was not confined to El Dorado. In Mexico, even as Cortés consolidated power, Spaniards spun stories of rich lands to the north. Survivors of Cabeza de Vaca's wanderings spoke of great cities, their words transformed into the myth of the 7 cities of Cibola. In the 1540s, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led a massive expedition into the American Southwest, chasing rumours of golden towns. Instead, he found pueblos built of adobe, societies rich in culture but not in the treasure he sought. His men traversed plains stretching farther than they could imagine, encountering the great bison herds and the nomadic peoples who hunted them. But the fabled Cibola remained an illusion. Coronado returned in disappointment. His expedition remembered more for what it revealed of geography than for conquest or riches. Similarly, the legend of Quivira lured explorers into the plains of Kansas, where they hoped to find another wealthy kingdom. Instead, they encountered societies whose wealth was measured in fields and herds, not gold. To Spaniards conditioned to equate value with bullion, these discoveries seemed failures, yet to history they revealed the vast scale of North America and the resilience of its peoples. These phantom kingdoms reveal much about the mindset of the conquistadors. Their frame of reference was shaped by the extraordinary successes of Mexico and Peru, where immense empires had indeed fallen into their hands, and treasures had been seized on a scale unprecedented in European experience. It seemed natural to assume that such wealth must exist elsewhere, that the world was filled with hidden empires waiting to be uncovered. Each rumour, however slight, was magnified into certainty. Each tale of gold dust or ceremonial wealth inflated into visions of entire cities glittering with treasure. The reality was more complex. Many of the societies Spaniards encountered did use gold and silver in ritual, but these metals were not stockpiled in the ways Europeans imagined. Wealth was often embedded in networks of reciprocity, displayed in festivals or buried in sacred places not hoarded as bullion. The Spanish hunger for precious metals led them to misunderstand what they saw, and when confronted with disappointment they moved the goalposts, insisting that the true El Dorado must lie farther away. For indigenous peoples, the intrusion of these expeditions was devastating. Bands of conquistadors marched into their lands demanding food and labour, spreading disease and sowing conflict. Even when no empire was conquered, the mere passage of an expedition could leave famine and death in its wake. Entire regions of South America's interior were scarred by repeated searches for El Dorado, each one consuming lives without ever delivering the promised reward. Despite endless failures, the legend endured because it served purposes beyond mere gold. For restless conquistadors, it offered a justification to gather men and supplies, a dream to persuade financiers and royal officials. For the Spanish crown, it provided a pretext to expand claims into new territories, to send expeditions that mapped rivers and mountains, even if they found no golden cities. For rival European powers, El Dorado became a symbol of possibility, a dream that justified voyages and competition with Spain. The myth thus outlived the age of the conquistadors, lingering in European imagination well into the 17th century. The pursuit of phantom kingdoms reveals a paradox at the heart of Spanish conquest. On one hand, it demonstrated the astonishing capacity of small bands of men to project power, to survive journeys across landscapes they did not understand, and to impose themselves, however briefly, on distant peoples. On the other, it showed the limits of that model when confronted with societies that did not conform to their expectations. Where no centralized state could be toppled, where wealth was not concentrated, their methods faltered. Yet instead of revising their assumptions, conquistadors doubled down on legends, insisting that another Mexico or Peru must exist somewhere just beyond the horizon. In this way, the search for El Dorado and other phantom kingdoms became a mirror, reflecting both the ambition and the desperation of the age. It drove men into jungles where they starved, into plains where they lost themselves, and into rivers that swallowed them whole. It produced maps and chronicles, enriched geographies, and expanded European awareness of the Americas, but it never delivered the promised cities of gold. The true treasure, if any, lay not in bullion, but in knowledge, though few of the conquistadors would have admitted it. The story of Spanish expansion into Central America unfolded in the shadow of the Great Conquest in Mexico and Peru, but it was no less violent or transformative. The lands stretching from the southern edge of New Spain down through Guatemala, Honduras and Nicaragua were rich in people, traditions and resources. Yet they lacked the singular imperial structures that had made the fall of Tenochtitlan or Cusco such dramatic spectacles. Here the conquistadors faced a mosaic of societies. Maya kingdoms with long histories of rivalry, scattered chiefdoms, and communities bound together by trade and tradition. To Spaniards who had come to expect a single ruler whose capture might deliver an entire empire, the conquest of Central America proved a far more fragmented and grinding process. In the years immediately after Cortés's triumph in Mexico, expeditions radiated outward from the Valley of Mexico in every direction. Some probed into northern deserts, others into the fertile lands to the south. Pedro de Alvarado, one of Cortés's most trusted lieutenants, emerged as the central figure in the push into Guatemala. Alvarado had already distinguished himself in the campaign against the Mexica, remembered both for his bravery and for his cruelty, particularly during the massacre at the festival of Toxcatl. Ambitious and eager to carve out his own domain, he led a force of Spaniards and thousands of indigenous allies from central Mexico into the highlands of Guatemala in 1523. The Maya world they entered was not a unified empire, but a collection of rival polities, some powerful and urban, others smaller and more rural. The Quiche, based in the city of Cumarcaj, were among the most formidable. They fielded large armies and commanded tribute from neighbouring groups, but centuries of inter-Maya warfare had left alliances fragile. Alvarado exploited these divisions with ruthless skill, forging temporary alliances with enemies of the Quiche, while bringing the weight of Spanish cavalry and steel to bear in battle. The clash at the Battle of El Pinar in 1524 broke Quiche resistance, and soon afterward their leaders were captured and executed. With the fall of Cumarcaj, Alvarado secured a foothold in the Guatemalan highlands. Yet conquest here did not bring immediate submission. The Cacique, longtime rivals of the Quiche, initially allied with the Spaniards, hoping to turn the balance of power to their advantage. But once it became clear that Spanish demands for tribute and labour were as heavy as those of their old enemies, they too rebelled. For years, fighting flared across the highlands, with indigenous groups rising, submitting, and rising again. The Spaniards established settlements like Santiago de Guatemala, but their hold was tenuous, dependent on constant campaigns and the imposition of encomiendas that pressed indigenous communities into service. Further east, the conquest of Honduras followed a similarly tortuous path. Rival expeditions converged on the region in the 1520s, creating confusion and conflict not only with indigenous peoples, but also among the Spaniards themselves. Cristobal de Olid, another lieutenant of Cortés, had been sent to establish Spanish authority, but quickly broke with his commander, attempting to carve out an independent realm. This betrayal drew Cortés himself southward, marching overland from Mexico in a grueling expedition that revealed both his ambition and his relentless pursuit of control. By the time he arrived, Olid had been killed, but the chaos left the region unstable. Indigenous resistance, combined with Spanish rivalries, delayed consolidation for years. The geography of Honduras, with its rugged mountains, dense forests, and varied peoples, complicated conquest. Unlike the centralized Mexica or Inca systems, local societies here resisted piecemeal, making it impossible for the Spaniards to claim total victory through a single decisive act. Settlements like Trujillo and later Comayagua became bases for Spanish authority, but constant campaigning was required to maintain even a tenuous hold. Disease ravaged indigenous communities, weakening their ability to resist, but Spanish hunger for labour and tribute deepened resentment. To the south, Nicaragua presented another stage for conquest. Gil González Dávila was among the first Spaniards to explore the region in the early 1520s, making contact with local rulers and baptizing thousands under the shadow of Spanish swords. Yet his efforts were limited, and it was Francisco Hernández de Córdoba who more firmly established Spanish settlements. Cities like León and Granada were founded, their placement chosen both for access to fertile land and for control of indigenous populations who could be drawn into encomiendas. Córdoba himself was caught in the shifting rivalries of conquistador politics, executed on orders from Pedrarias Dávila, the governor of Panama, who sought to control Nicaragua for himself. The conquest of Nicaragua revealed the competing pressures that shaped Spanish expansion. On one hand, the land was fertile and well suited for agriculture, particularly for cattle and crops that Spaniards introduced. On the other, indigenous resistance and the brutal exploitation of labour created constant instability. Many Nicaraguans were enslaved and shipped to Panama and the Caribbean, feeding a transcolonial demand for workers as native populations elsewhere collapsed. This export of people deepened the devastation of local societies, reducing populations drastically within a generation. Throughout Central America, the pattern repeated. Spanish captains carving out settlements, imposing encomiendas, clashing with indigenous resistance, and competing among themselves for favour and authority. The crown attempted to bring order by sending governors and judges, but distance made enforcement weak. The conquistadors, hardened by campaigns in Mexico and the Caribbean, pursued their ambitions with little regard for royal instructions when these conflicted with personal gain. The result was a patchwork of settlements and territories, unified only loosely under Spanish rule. The indigenous peoples of Guatemala, Honduras and Nicaragua endured immense suffering, yet they also displayed resilience. Rebellions flared repeatedly, often taking advantage of Spanish rivalries or external pressures. The rugged terrain provided refuges where communities could evade Spanish control, preserving traditions and autonomy. Missionaries, particularly friars of the Dominican and Franciscan orders, sometimes defended indigenous rights, denouncing abuses and seeking to protect converts. Their efforts had limited success, but they introduced another layer to the complex interactions of conquest, the tension between spiritual conquest and material exploitation. Over time, Spanish control solidified, not through single decisive victories, but through attrition, settlement, and the relentless imposition of colonial structures. Towns grew, encomiendas expanded, and indigenous labour was redirected towards Spanish needs. The old rivalries among Maya kingdoms or between local chiefdoms were gradually subsumed under the greater disruption of colonial rule, yet memories of resistance persisted, shaping identities long after the battles ended. For the conquistadors themselves, Central America was both a proving ground and a disappointment. It lacked the immediate torrents of gold that Peru and Mexico had provided, but it offered fertile lands that could sustain long-term wealth through agriculture and cattle. Many who failed to find fortunes and treasure found them instead in land and labour, becoming colonial lords whose descendants would dominate the region for centuries. The violence of the initial conquests gave way to the slower violence of colonial order, where indigenous communities were bound to new economic and social systems that transformed their world. The conquest of Guatemala, Honduras and Nicaragua thus illustrated another face of the Spanish enterprise. Here there were no golden ransoms or spectacular cities to seize, but there were enduring struggles, rivalries, and the relentless drive of conquistadors to claim new lands. The process was messier, more fragmented, but no less consequential. Central America became a crucial link between Mexico and South America, a corridor of empire that connected the two great conquests and tied the Caribbean to the Pacific. In its towns and countrysides, the patterns of Spanish colonization took shape in forms that would endure long after the conquistadors themselves were gone. The military campaigns of the conquistadors, with their steel, horses and cannon, brought empires to ruin and carved Spanish settlements into new landscapes. But conquest in Iberian eyes was never meant to be measured by force of arms alone. Alongside the soldier rode the friar, and alongside the sword came the cross. From the earliest voyages, Spanish rulers and clerics had insisted that the purpose of expansion was not only wealth and dominion, but also the spread of Christianity. The defeat of the Mexica and the Inca opened the way for armies of missionaries as determined in their mission as any soldier was in battle. For the friars of the Franciscan, Dominican, and later Jesuit orders, the task was nothing less than the remaking of entire worlds, a spiritual conquest that sought to replace indigenous religions with the Catholic faith and to draw new subjects into the universal fold of Christendom. From the beginning, this mission carried within it contradictions. The conquistadors imposed systems of forced labour and tribute that devastated indigenous societies, while missionaries preached the gospel of compassion and salvation. Many friars condemned the abuses of encomenderos, yet relied on colonial structures to support their work. Spanish officials proclaimed that conquest was justified by the imperative to spread the true faith, yet the methods employed often resembled coercion more than persuasion. Still, the religious dimension gave the conquest a moral framework that its advocates could present to Europe, even as its reality was soaked in violence. In Mexico, the arrival of 12 Franciscan friars in 1524 signalled the beginning of organised evangelization. Known as the 12 Apostles of Mexico, they were received with ceremony and hope by Hernán Cortés, who understood that their work lent legitimacy to his conquests. These friars, barefoot and humble, set about learning local languages, preaching to large gatherings, and establishing schools for indigenous elites. They believed that by converting the nobility, the common people would follow. They destroyed temples, toppled idols, and built churches, often directly atop the ruins of sacred spaces, creating visible symbols of transformation. To the Spaniards, this was the triumph of Christianity over paganism. To the indigenous, it was the violent interruption of traditions rooted in centuries of history. The friars were both destroyers and preservers. While they sought to eradicate indigenous religions, they also recorded them in detail, producing some of the earliest ethnographies of Mesoamerica. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan, compiled the monumental Florentine Codex, documenting Nahua beliefs, rituals, and daily life. His work was intended to aid in conversion, but it preserved knowledge that otherwise might have been lost. This paradox defined the missionary enterprise. It erased, but it also recorded. It condemned, but it also studied. In the Andes, similar processes unfolded. Franciscans, Dominicans, and later Jesuits moved into Cusco and surrounding regions, confronting Inca traditions deeply rooted in ancestor worship, sacred landscapes, and devotion to Inti, the sun. Missionaries sought to dismantle these practices, declaring them idolatry. They tore down huacas, sacred shrines scattered across the landscape, and built churches in their place. They baptized thousands, sometimes through persuasion, often through mass ceremonies that blurred the line between voluntary conversion and compulsion. Resistance was inevitable. Many Andean communities outwardly adopted Christian forms while continuing traditional rituals in secret. This blending produced what Spaniards called idolatry, but what historians now recognize as syncretism, the fusion of Christian and indigenous beliefs. The Virgin Mary was sometimes associated with Pachamama, the Earth Mother, while saints took on the roles of older deities. Missionaries often denounced such practices as heresy, launching campaigns of extirpation, but syncretism persisted, shaping a Christianity distinct to the Americas. The missionary project was not confined to urban centres. Friars fanned out into rural villages, establishing doctrinas where they lived among indigenous communities. They taught prayers, organised festivals, and introduced new rhythms of life tied to the Catholic calendar. They also established schools where indigenous boys were taught to read, write, and sing in Latin, preparing them to serve as catechists and assistants. Some of these students became important cultural intermediaries, bridging worlds even as they helped dismantle their own traditions. The Dominicans were particularly vocal in denouncing Spanish abuses. Antonio de Montesinos delivered a fiery sermon in Hispaniola in 1511, declaring that the encomienda system was unjust and that Spaniards were committing mortal sins by enslaving the very people they claimed to convert. His words reached Spain and influenced debates at court, laying the groundwork for the career of Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas, once an encomendero himself, renounced his holdings and became the most famous advocate for indigenous rights. He argued passionately that conversion must be peaceful, that force was incompatible with true faith, and that the destruction of indigenous peoples was both immoral and self-defeating. His writings, particularly the Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, painted a devastating picture of Spanish cruelty and circulated widely in Europe, fueling what became known as the Black Legend of Spanish conquest. Yet even Las Casas, for all his advocacy, still believed that indigenous peoples needed to be transformed by Christianity. His vision was more humane but still paternalistic, envisioning communities organised under friars, living simple Christian lives. His opposition to encomenderos put him at odds with many colonists, but his influence at court shaped legislation, including the new laws of 1542, which sought to limit abuses and end hereditary encomiendas. Enforcement of these laws was weak, but the very attempt reflected the power of missionary voices in shaping imperial policy. The Jesuits, arriving later in the 16th century, brought a different style. Highly educated and disciplined, they founded missions that became semi-autonomous communities, especially in regions like Paraguay. There they organized indigenous populations into reducciones, settlements where Christian teaching, agriculture and defense were combined. These missions shielded communities from the worst excesses of encomenderos, creating spaces where indigenous people could live under Jesuit guidance. Critics accused the Jesuits of creating states within states, too independent of royal control, but their missions became famous for their productivity and relative protection of native populations. When the Jesuits were expelled from Spanish territories in the 18th century, many of these communities collapsed, revealing how dependent they had become on the order's leadership. The spiritual conquest also extended to the realm of art, music and ritual. Missionaries encouraged indigenous artisans to build churches adorned with local motifs, producing unique styles that blended European and native aesthetics. In Cusco and Puebla, schools of painting flourished, depicting biblical scenes with Andean landscapes or Mesoamerican symbols woven into the background. Music became a powerful tool, with choirs of indigenous singers performing Latin hymns, sometimes accompanied by native instruments adapted to Christian liturgy. These cultural forms allowed Christianity to take root in ways that were not entirely European but deeply hybrid. At the same time, the missionary project was also an instrument of control. Baptism registers, confession, and attendance at Mass provided colonial authorities with new means of monitoring populations. The Church became intertwined with governance, its festivals marking time, its priests mediating disputes, and its rituals sanctifying Spanish authority. Christianity was not simply a matter of belief, but a structure that reordered daily life, embedding colonial power into the rhythms of work and worship. For many indigenous people, conversion was pragmatic as much as spiritual. Adopting Christian forms could protect against accusations of idolatry, secure favour from authorities, or provide access to resources. Communities negotiated the terms of conversion, sometimes embracing aspects of Catholicism that resonated with older traditions while resisting others. Over generations, Christianity became part of the fabric of life, but always shaped by local interpretation and memory of what had come before. The spiritual conquest was thus both sweeping and incomplete. Millions were baptized, churches rose across the continent, and Catholicism became a defining element of colonial identity. Yet beneath the surface, older beliefs persisted, reinterpreted and hidden, surviving in rituals, festivals and stories. The friars believed they had triumphed, but in truth they had entered into a dialogue of force and adaptation, one that produced a new religious world neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous. The men who crossed the ocean as adventurers, soldiers and fortune seekers rarely imagined themselves as administrators or governors, yet the very success of their campaigns thrust them into positions of power, transforming conquistadors into rulers over vast territories and millions of people. The qualities that had served them in battle, audacity, cunning and ruthlessness, didn't always translate smoothly into governance. As conquistadors settled into the roles of governors, they carried with them the habits of war, the thirst for wealth, and the personal ambitions that had driven them to conquer. The result was often a volatile mixture of authority and abuse, where men who had once lived by the sword now wielded power over entire provinces, acting as tyrants in practice while still claiming to serve the crown. In Mexico, Hernán Cortés himself became the model of this transformation. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, he moved quickly to consolidate control, declaring himself Captain General of New Spain. He parcelled out encomiendas to his followers, built alliances with local elites, and established Mexico City atop the ruins of the Aztec capital. His rule was marked by both vision and brutality. Cortés encouraged exploration, sending expeditions north and south to extend Spanish claims, but he also faced charges of despotism. His rivals accused him of hoarding wealth, mistreating settlers, and failing to submit to royal oversight. Royal officials sent to investigate him found a man who had acted with near-sovereign independence, dispensing justice and rewards as though he were king. Though Cortés retained fame and influence, he was gradually sidelined, recalled to Spain to answer inquiries, and replaced by viceroys who represented direct royal authority. The crown, wary of conquistadors becoming autonomous lords, preferred to bind their power, even if it meant alienating those who had secured the empire in the first place. In Peru, the problem was even more acute. Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, once partners, descended into bitter rivalry over the spoils of conquest. Almagro, embittered by his failed expedition to Chile and by the lesser rewards he had received compared to Pizarro, claimed rights to Cusco. The dispute escalated into open conflict. In 1538, their factions clashed at the Battle of Las Salinas, where Pizarro's brothers led his forces to victory. Almagro was captured and executed, his body left to rot, a stark reminder of how quickly conquistador camaraderie could dissolve into civil war. But the cycle of vengeance did not end there. 3 years later, in 1541, Almagro's son and his supporters struck back, assassinating Francisco Pizarro in his own palace in Lima. The conqueror of Peru, once at the pinnacle of power, was left bleeding on the floor, betrayed by fellow Spaniards. These internal conflicts revealed a deep tension within the world of the conquistadors. They had fought under the banner of Spain, but their loyalty to the crown was often secondary to their loyalty to personal ambition and family. The distances involved, the lack of immediate oversight, and the vast wealth at stake created conditions where men acted like independent princes. They granted themselves titles, dispensed land, and demanded obedience from settlers and indigenous alike. The monarchy, anxious to prevent the rise of rival sovereigns, gradually moved to curb these tendencies, sending viceroys, judges, and royal officials to impose order. But the conquistadors resisted fiercely, sometimes openly rebelling against royal decrees that threatened their privileges. The enactment of the new laws in 1542 was one flashpoint. These laws, influenced by the advocacy of Bartolomé de las Casas and others, sought to reduce abuses in the encomienda system and prevent it from becoming hereditary. To the conquistadors, this was an assault on the very foundation of their power and wealth. They had risked their lives and fortunes to conquer lands, and they saw the encomienda as their rightful reward. When officials arrived to enforce the laws, rebellions erupted. In Peru, Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco, rallied settlers against the crown, declaring himself leader of the resistance. His rebellion escalated into full-scale war against royal forces. For several years, Peru was convulsed by civil strife, with conquistador armies clashing not against indigenous foes, but against representatives of their own king. Gonzalo Pizarro's defiance ended in 1548 at the Battle of Jaquiahuana, where he was defeated and executed, his head displayed as a warning. The rebellion had failed, but it revealed how fragile royal authority could be in lands won by conquistador arms. Elsewhere, conquistadors also transformed into petty tyrants. In Central America, men like Pedro Arias Dávila in Panama or Pedro de Alvarado in Guatemala ruled with near-despotic authority, extracting wealth and labour from indigenous communities and rivals alike. Pedro Arias, infamous for his cruelty, clashed with other conquistadors, executing Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the discoverer of the Pacific, out of jealousy and fear. Alvarado, charismatic yet ruthless, launched expeditions to expand his reach, even seeking to join the conquest of Peru, though he ultimately sold his forces to Pizarro. These figures acted less like royal officials and more like warlords, using violence and patronage to secure their positions. The pattern was not limited to Spanish America. In the Philippines decades later, conquistador mentalities persisted, as Spanish captains imposed rule over scattered islands through alliances, battles, and missionary work. The conquistador ethos, ambitious, personal, and often violent, proved adaptable to new settings, though always in tension with the crown's desire for centralized control. The transformation of conquistadors into governors also reshaped indigenous societies. Encomiendas bound native communities to Spanish lords who acted with near-feudal authority. Governors demanded tribute in labour and goods, levied taxes, and used indigenous leaders as intermediaries. While some conquistadors married into local nobility, forging dynasties that blended Spanish and indigenous elites, others ruled through sheer force. Indigenous resistance was often crushed, but it persisted in rebellions, desertions, and subtle forms of defiance. Despite their excesses, some conquistadors attempted to adapt to governance with mixed results. They oversaw the construction of towns, roads, and churches, introduced European crops and livestock, and attempted to establish legal codes. Yet their vision of rule was shaped by their experiences as conquerors. Authority derived from victory, rewards flowed from violence, and loyalty was secured by fear. These habits often clashed with the expectations of settlers who demanded stability, or with royal officials who insisted on orderly administration. The legacy of conquistadors as governors, tyrants, and rebels reveals the contradictions of empire in its first generation. They were indispensable in creating Spain's dominion in the Americas, but they were ill-suited to sustain it. Their personal ambitions undermined unity, their abuses provoked indigenous unrest, and their defiance of royal authority forced the crown to impose new institutions. By the mid-16th century, the age of the conquistadors was giving way to the age of viceroys and bureaucrats. Yet the imprint of those first rulers remained, etched into the foundations of colonial society in the form of cities, encomiendas, and social hierarchies that persisted for centuries. For the men themselves, the transformation from conqueror to governor was often a poisoned chalice. Hernán Cortés died embittered, feeling unappreciated by the crown. Francisco Pizarro was murdered by rivals. Gonzalo Pizarro was executed as a rebel. Alvarado fell in battle in Mexico, struck by a horse. Few ended their lives in peace or contentment. They had won kingdoms but lost control of them, seized power only to see it slip away to royal officials or rival conquistadors. Yet their names remained etched into chronicles, remembered as both founders and destroyers, figures who embodied the contradictions of conquest. The story of conquest has often been told as one of sudden collapse and inevitable domination, but beneath the triumphal narratives written by Spaniards lay another reality, one of constant resistance, rebellion, and the persistent survival of indigenous peoples who refused to disappear. The empires of Mexico and Peru may have fallen swiftly once their rulers were captured, yet conquest was never a single act. It was an ongoing process marked by decades of uprisings, retreats, and negotiations in which indigenous communities sought to defend autonomy, adapt to new pressures, and preserve traditions even under the crushing weight of Spanish power. In the highlands of Peru, resistance began almost immediately after the death of Atahualpa and the fall of Cuzco. The Spaniards attempted to rule through puppet emperors, installing Manco Inca as a figurehead, but they underestimated his determination. Initially cooperative, Manco soon found Spanish arrogance intolerable. The abuse of his wives, the constant demands for tribute, and the disregard for Inca authority drove him to revolt. In 1536, he escaped from Cusco and rallied tens of thousands of warriors, launching one of the largest indigenous uprisings of the century. His forces surrounded Cusco, laying siege to the Spanish garrison for months. Fires consumed much of the city, and for a time it seemed the Spaniards might be overwhelmed. But steel, cavalry, and the support of rival indigenous allies tipped the balance. The siege failed, though at tremendous cost. and Manco withdrew to the remote Vilcabamba region, establishing a neo-Inca state that persisted for decades. From there, his descendants continued to defy Spanish authority, launching raids and sustaining an alternative vision of Inca rule until the final capture of Tupac Amaru in 1572 brought the line to an end. In Mexico, resistance took different forms. The Mexica capital had been reduced to rubble, yet outside the Valley of Mexico, other peoples resisted incorporation into Spanish rule. The Mixton War of the 1540s in western Mexico revealed the volatility of the frontier. In the rugged hills of present-day Jalisco and Zacatecas, indigenous groups rose against Spanish demands for labour and tribute. They fortified mountain strongholds, fought with determination, and inflicted heavy casualties on Spanish forces. It took years of campaigns with reinforcements from across New Spain to crush the rebellion. The memory of Mixton haunted settlers, reminding them that indigenous submission was never complete. Later, the Chichimeca Wars in the same region continued the cycle of conflict. These semi-nomadic peoples resisted Spanish attempts to control the silver-rich lands of northern Mexico. They waged guerrilla warfare, ambushing caravans, burning settlements, and evading pitched battles. Spanish cavalry, so decisive in open-field engagements, found themselves frustrated in the rough terrain where mobile bands melted into hills and deserts. For decades, the frontier remained unstable, forcing Spaniards to negotiate as much as to fight. Peace was eventually secured not by total victory, but through a combination of military pressure, missionary work, and the distribution of goods to win alliances. The Chichimeca struggle showed that resistance could not always be crushed. It had to be managed, and survival could mean bending Spanish strategies to indigenous terms. In Central America, uprisings erupted repeatedly as communities sought to resist the burdens of encomienda and forced labour. In Guatemala, the Kaqchikel, once allies of the Spaniards, turned against them when demands grew unbearable. They waged war in the highlands, only to be met with brutal suppression. In Nicaragua, entire towns were depopulated as people fled into forests or were seized for export as slaves. Resistance here was often expressed not through large battles, but through flight, evasion, and the quiet refusal to cooperate. Communities retreated to remote areas, where friars and encomenderos alike struggled to impose authority. The Caribbean, the earliest stage of conquest, also witnessed resistance, though disease and overwork had already devastated populations. In Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, figures like Hatue became symbols of defiance. Hatue, a Taíno leader who fled Hispaniola to resist Spanish incursions in Cuba, rallied warriors and fought until his capture. Before his execution, he reportedly rejected baptism when told he might join Spaniards in heaven, declaring he would rather go to hell than share eternity with his oppressors. His defiance captured the spirit of indigenous refusal, even as the demographic collapse of the Caribbean limited the scope of resistance. Farther south, in Chile, resistance became an enduring fact of colonial life. The Mapuche, fiercely independent and organised through decentralised leadership, refused to submit to Spanish rule. Their war against the Spaniards, later called the Arauco War, began in the 1540s and raged for centuries. At the Battle of Tucapel in 1553, they captured and executed Pedro de Valdivia, the conqueror of Chile, delivering a stunning blow to Spanish ambitions. Time and again, Spanish settlements were attacked and destroyed, forcing colonists into defensive positions. The frontier in Chile hardened into a zone of perpetual conflict, where neither side could achieve decisive victory. The resilience of the Mapuche ensured that large parts of southern Chile remained outside Spanish control well into the colonial period, a rare case where indigenous resistance preserved autonomy for generations. Resistance was not always expressed in open warfare. Many communities adopted strategies of survival that allowed them to endure under Spanish domination, while preserving aspects of their traditions. Syncretism in religion, for instance, allowed old gods to live on under the guise of Christian saints. Festivals blended indigenous and Catholic elements, masking continuity beneath apparent conversion. Language, too, became a site of persistence. While Spanish was imposed in administration and schooling, indigenous languages like Nahuatl, Quechua, Aymara and Mayan dialects endured, spoken in homes and villages, shaping identities that outlived conquest. Some communities used Spanish institutions to resist. They learned to write petitions in Spanish, appealing to courts and the crown against abusive encomenderos. Indigenous nobles in particular adapted to colonial legal systems, presenting themselves as loyal subjects while defending local autonomy. These strategies revealed remarkable flexibility, turning the tools of empire into means of survival. Slavery and forced labour provoked resistance in other forms. In Peru, the mita system adapted from Inca traditions of labour service, but reshaped for Spanish needs, conscripted thousands to work in silver mines like Potosí. Conditions were brutal and death tolls staggering. Workers resisted by fleeing, by feigning illness, or by negotiating exemptions through local leaders. Communities organised rotations to minimise loss, ensuring that no single family was destroyed. In the Caribbean, where African slavery expanded as indigenous populations collapsed, enslaved Africans joined indigenous people in rebellions, creating new forms of resistance that blended traditions from multiple continents. Maroon communities, formed by runaway slaves and indigenous fugitives, dotted the landscapes of the Americas, living beyond Spanish reach and raiding settlements when opportunity arose. Rebellions continued into later centuries, long after the first generation of conquistadors had passed. In the Andes, millenarian movements emerged, fueled by prophecies that the Inca would return. The most famous of these came much later, in the 18th century, with the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II, who invoked Inca heritage to rally thousands against Spanish rule. Though crushed, such movements showed that memories of conquest and defiance remained alive, feeding hopes of restoration even centuries after the first defeats. The endurance of indigenous peoples in the face of conquest was perhaps the most profound form of resistance. Despite catastrophic population losses from disease, war and exploitation, millions survived, adapted, and continued their traditions. Entire towns rebuilt themselves under new conditions, communities reconstituted their social fabric, and cultural practices adjusted to colonial realities without disappearing. Resistance was not always dramatic or violent. Often it was quiet, expressed in the maintenance of language, rituals, and communal solidarity. The Spaniards may have imposed domination, but they did not erase the identities of the peoples they conquered. For the Spanish crown, rebellions forced constant adjustments. Military campaigns drained resources, missionary projects had to be expanded, and compromises were often made. Officials realised that empire could not be sustained solely by force. It required negotiation, accommodation, and the selective incorporation of indigenous elites. Survival depended on balancing coercion with co-optation, ensuring that enough indigenous leaders saw advantage in collaboration to keep the system functioning. The image of total conquest, so often celebrated in chronicles, was therefore misleading. Beneath the surface of Spanish rule, indigenous resistance persisted in countless forms, shaping the contours of colonial society. Rebellions reminded Spaniards of their vulnerability, while survival strategies ensured that indigenous identities endured. The story of conquest was not a one-time event, but an ongoing struggle, where domination was contested, negotiated, and never complete. From the earliest voyages, the search for wealth in the Americas was intertwined with the search for labour. Conquistadors imagined golden kingdoms and mountains of silver, but they quickly discovered that extracting these riches required hands to dig, carry, and produce. Indigenous populations, though vast, were devastated by epidemic disease and the crushing demands of encomiendas. To fill the gap, Spaniards turned to the enslavement of both native peoples and, increasingly, Africans transported across the Atlantic. the slave trade became a central feature of the colonial order, shaping societies as profoundly as conquest itself. At the very beginning, Columbus himself had envisioned slavery as part of the New World enterprise. On his second voyage, he sent shiploads of Taino captives back to Spain, proposing that their sale could finance further expeditions. Although Queen Isabella initially resisted, insisting that her new subjects were to be protected, the practice of enslaving indigenous peoples quickly took root in the Caribbean. Conquistadors rationalized it by claiming captives were prisoners of war or rebels who had resisted Spanish authority. The requirement of the requerimiento, read aloud in Spanish to people who could not understand it, offered a flimsy pretext. Those who refused immediate submission could be justly enslaved. The early decades saw mass enslavement of Caribbean peoples. Thousands were shipped from Hispaniola, Puerto Rico and Cuba to labour in mines, fields and households. Others were exported to Spain, fueling a market for human beings that tied the Atlantic together. Raids extended beyond the islands into the mainland, with slaving expeditions reaching as far as the Yucatan and Florida. For many conquistadors, slaves were as valuable as gold, a portable source of wealth that could be sold, traded, or put to work in new settlements. But disease and overwork decimated Caribbean populations at a catastrophic pace. By the 1520s, the Taino of Hispaniola were nearly extinct, and similar patterns unfolded on other islands. The collapse of indigenous labour forced conquistadors and colonists to look elsewhere. Some turned to the mainland, capturing natives from Central America, Colombia and Venezuela, transporting them to work in Spanish outposts. Others turned across the Atlantic seeking permission to import Africans, whose endurance under tropical conditions was imagined to be superior and whose capture did not carry the same theological ambiguities that troubled the enslavement of baptized natives. The Crown gradually legalized and organized the African slave trade to meet colonial demands. In 1518, a royal license granted merchants the right to import African slaves directly to the Americas, bypassing Spain. This asiento system would expand over the following centuries, embedding slavery into the economic foundation of empire. For conquistadors, Africans became essential in both household and productive labour. On islands like Hispaniola and Cuba, African slaves worked side by side with the dwindling indigenous populations in fields and sugar mills, laying the groundwork for economies that would dominate the Caribbean in later centuries. In Mexico and Peru, the enslavement of indigenous peoples remained widespread during the initial decades. Conquistadors argued that warfare against rebellious groups justified their capture and sale. Thousands of indigenous people were shipped from the mainland to Caribbean islands or to Panama, treated as commodities in networks of exchange. Slave raiding became an extension of conquest, with expeditions launched not only to claim territory but to seize captives. In the wake of Cortés's campaigns, slavers roamed northern Mexico and Central America, devastating communities that had not even been directly targeted for conquest. Royal officials attempted to regulate the practice. Laws were issued forbidding the enslavement of peaceful Indians, but these distinctions were easily manipulated. Spaniards labelled entire communities as rebellious to justify their capture, or accused leaders of idolatry and cannibalism, crimes that supposedly merited enslavement. In practice, the line between legal and illegal slavery was blurry, and conquistadors exploited the ambiguity to maintain their access to labour. The shift toward African slavery did not mean an end to indigenous bondage. Instead, both systems coexisted, intertwined in the colonial economy. Encomiendas extracted tribute and labour from settled populations, while slavery provided mobile and expendable workers for dangerous or remote tasks. Mines like those at Zacatecas in Mexico or Potosí in Peru consumed thousands of lives, demanding steady flows of labour. Indigenous metayos were conscripted through the emita system, but African slaves were also purchased to supplement the workforce, particularly in specialised or gruelling roles. In coastal plantations, Africans often predominated, while in highland communities, indigenous labour remained the backbone. For the conquistadors themselves, the trade in human beings was both profitable and practical. Captives could be sold to finance further expeditions, ransom for supplies, or kept as personal servants. Slavery allowed small bands of Spaniards to amplify their power, maintaining households and enterprises beyond what their numbers alone could support. The possession of slaves became a marker of status, a visible sign of success in the conquest. In wills and inventories, conquistadors listed their human property alongside horses, weapons and land, treating them as part of the wealth they hoped to pass to heirs. Yet slavery also provoked moral debates that reverberated through the empire. Figures like Las Casas denounced the enslavement of indigenous peoples, arguing that they were rational beings capable of receiving the faith and thus not to be treated as animals. In one notorious episode, Las Casas proposed importing Africans as an alternative, believing they might better withstand the rigours of labour and spare natives from destruction. He later regretted this suggestion, recognising that it merely shifted cruelty onto another people. But the idea that African slavery was more justifiable took root, entrenching the transatlantic trade even as indigenous slavery was gradually restricted. The sheer scale of African importation transformed colonial societies. By the mid-16th century, thousands of Africans had arrived in Mexico, the Caribbean, and northern South America. Their labour underpinned sugar plantations, cattle ranches, and urban economies. They also resisted, running away to form maroon communities in forests and mountains, where they sometimes allied with indigenous groups. These communities, from the planks of Colombia to the settlements of Jamaica, became persistent threats to Spanish authority, requiring military campaigns to suppress. Their existence testified to the refusal of enslaved people to accept bondage quietly, just as indigenous rebellions revealed the limits of Spanish control. The trade in human beings linked the conquistadors to a global economy. Portuguese traders captured or purchased captives in Africa, transported them across the Atlantic and sold them to Spaniards in the Americas. Payments flowed back to Europe, enriching financiers who never set foot in the New World. The lives of enslaved Africans, seized on one continent and forced to labour on another, became part of the machinery that sustained Spanish imperial ambitions. For conquistadors, the trade was both local and global, as the bodies of those they enslaved tied their fortunes to markets stretching from Seville to Angola to Veracruz. Enslavement also left deep marks on indigenous societies. Communities targeted for raids were depopulated, their social structures shattered. Survivors lived in constant fear of capture, fleeing into remote areas or submitting reluctantly to Spanish demands in the hope of protection. Families were torn apart, children sold away, elders executed when they could not be marched long distances. The trauma of these decades reshaped demographics and memories, leaving scars remembered for generations. Even as laws and decrees multiplied, prohibiting certain forms of slavery and regulating others, enforcement lagged. Governors, themselves conquistadors or allied to them, often ignored restrictions. Royal judges sent to investigate were bribed, threatened, or sidelined. The reality on the ground was that the conquistadors, far from the eyes of Spain, acted according to immediate needs and opportunities. Slaves remained an integral part of their world, no matter what the laws declared. The slave trade also bound the conquistadors into cycles of rebellion and repression. Enslaved workers resisted through sabotage, escape, and armed revolt. In Mexico City, authorities uncovered conspiracies among African slaves to overthrow Spanish masters. In Peru, enslaved Africans joined indigenous uprisings, forming multi-ethnic bands of rebels. Fear of revolt haunted conquistadors, shaping colonial policies that combined harsh discipline with efforts to divide enslaved populations by origin, language, or ethnicity. The brutality of slavery was matched by the paranoia it generated, as conquistadors lived with the knowledge that those they exploited might rise against them at any moment. In the long view, the participation of conquistadors in the slave trade ensured that the conquest was not merely a military act, but part of a larger system of human exploitation. Their victories opened the door to economies that devoured lives as surely as any battlefield. The riches of Mexico and Peru were extracted not only from temples and palaces, but from the forced labour of countless men and women, indigenous and African alike. The conquest thus cannot be separated from the history of slavery. They were two sides of the same coin, inseparable in the making of the empire. The immediate spoils of conquest dazzled the Spaniards, but it was not the ransom of Atahualpa or the melted treasures of Tenochtitlan that truly reshaped Europe. Those were sudden bursts of wealth, impressive but fleeting. What transformed Spain, and by extension much of the world, was the steady flow of silver that poured from the mines of the Americas over centuries. The conquests had opened doors to resources on a scale unimaginable in the 15th century, and silver became the lifeblood of empire, fueling wars, trade, and ambitions across continents. The discovery of great silver deposits in places like Zacatecas in northern Mexico and Potosí in the Bolivian highlands marked a turning point. Potosí, located in the cold, barren Andes at over 13,000 feet above sea level, rose from obscurity in the 1540s to become one of the largest and richest cities in the world. A single mountain, Cerro Rico, yielded veins of silver so vast that contemporaries described it as a mountain made of the metal itself. The Spanish crown and conquistadors alike recognized immediately that this was no temporary bonanza, but a resource that could sustain wealth for generations. The scale of production was staggering. Potosí attracted tens of thousands of workers, settlers, merchants, and adventurers. Indigenous communities were drawn into the meter system, conscripted to labour in the mines for months at a time under brutal conditions. Mercury, essential for refining silver ore, was supplied from mines at Huancavelica, creating a deadly partnership of industries that consumed lives at a relentless pace. Workers endured freezing temperatures, toxic fumes, and collapses that buried them alive. Mortality was immense, yet the system endured, continually replenished by forced drafts of labour. In Mexico, Zacatecas became the twin engine of silver production. Located in the rugged frontier of northern New Spain, it drew settlers into lands contested by Chichimeca groups, sparking decades of conflict. Once pacified, Zacatecas grew into a bustling mining centre, linked by roads to Mexico City and to Veracruz on the Gulf Coast, where silver was shipped to Spain. Other sites, like Guanajuato and Taxco, added to the flow. Together, these mines made the Spanish Americas the greatest source of silver in the world. The silver did not remain in the Americas. Each year, fleets carried treasure across the Atlantic in convoys carefully guarded against pirates and rival powers. The Casa de Contratación in Seville regulated the trade, registering shipments, collecting royal taxes like the Quinto Real, the Royal Fifth, and channeling silver into the heart of Spain. From Seville, silver spread across Europe, paying for imports, financing wars, and feeding the coffers of bankers in Genoa, Antwerp, and beyond. The effect on Spain was paradoxical. On the one hand, the inflow of silver gave the crown resources unmatched by any other European monarchy. It financed the armies of Charles V and Philip V, sustaining the Habsburgs in their struggles against France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant states. Spanish soldiers fought across Europe, their wages often paid from American bullion. The grandeur of Philip II's court, the construction of monumental palaces like El Escorial, and the flowering of Spanish art and culture owed much to the wealth of the Indies. Spain projected itself as the defender of Catholicism and the most powerful kingdom of Christendom, and silver underwrote these ambitions. On the other hand, the abundance of silver created vulnerabilities. Inflation, known as the price revolution, swept across Europe in the 16th century as the sudden increase in money supply drove up prices. The Spanish economy, heavily reliant on imports and on aristocratic consumption rather than domestic production, struggled to adapt. Much of the silver that entered Spain quickly flowed out again, used to pay debts to foreign bankers or to purchase goods that Spain itself did not produce in sufficient quantities. Thus, while Spanish monarchs commanded immense resources, they also sank deeper into debt, their power propped up by a flow of silver they did not fully control. Globally, the impact was even greater. American silver became the first truly global currency. From Europe, it flowed into the Mediterranean and the Ottoman Empire, into India and Africa, and most significantly into China. Ming China had shifted its tax system to require payments in silver, creating enormous demand. Spanish silver carried first across the Atlantic to Seville, and then onward, or shipped directly across the Pacific via the Manila galleons from Acapulco to the Philippines, became the medium that lubricated world trade. European merchants used silver to buy Chinese silks, porcelains, and spices, goods that were then sold across Europe for profit. The circle was vast. Silver mined by conscripted Andean labourers travelled to Manila, was exchanged for Chinese luxuries, and returned to Europe to adorn the tables of the wealthy. The conquistadors themselves saw the immediate profits. Those who controlled mines became fabulously wealthy, their fortunes securing noble titles and estates in Spain. Many reinvested in further ventures, funding ships, expeditions, and towns. The influx of silver reshaped social hierarchies in the colonies, creating wealthy mining elites whose power rivaled that of older encomendero families. Colonial cities like Potosi, Zacatecas, and Lima became cosmopolitan centres, filled with churches, markets, and artisans, all supported by the wealth of the mines. At its height, Potosi rivaled the great capitals of Europe in population, its streets filled with Spaniards, indigenous workers, African slaves, and merchants from across the empire. But the human cost was immense. For indigenous communities, the meter system drained populations, sending men far from their homes for months of back-breaking labour. Families struggled to survive without able-bodied men, and mortality from mining conditions tore holes in villages. Mercury poisoning from Huancavelica spread suffering, contaminating workers and environments alike. African slaves were also drawn into mining, forced to endure the same dangers. The wealth that sustained Spain and Europe was thus built on foundations of exploitation and death. The silver trade also attracted rivals. Pirates and privateers from France, England, and the Netherlands prowled the Caribbean and Atlantic, seeking to intercept Spanish convoys. Figures like Francis Drake became legendary for striking at Spanish treasure ships, seizing fortunes that symbolized both Spanish wealth and Spanish vulnerability. The treasure fleets became symbols of empire, glittering prizes that drew the enmity of Spain's competitors and forced it to spend heavily on naval defence. Within Europe, the flow of silver reshaped economies and ambitions. States sought to emulate Spain, launching their own ventures in the Americas and elsewhere in hopes of capturing similar wealth. The Dutch and English East India companies, though built more on trade than conquest, were inspired by the riches flowing from the Spanish colonies. The global economic system that emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries had at its core the silver of Mexico and Peru, linking continents in networks of exchange unprecedented in scale. For Spain itself, dependence on silver proved both empowering and destabilizing. It allowed monarchs to field armies and pursue vast ambitions, but it also masked structural weaknesses. Agriculture and manufacturing within Spain languished, neglected in favour of imports. Nobility consumed wealth without producing it, while commoners bore the burden of rising prices. Repeated bankruptcies struck the crown as debts exceeded revenues despite the constant arrival of treasure. The irony of empire was that Spain, sitting atop the richest mines in the world, found itself perpetually short of funds, its power propped up by fragile flows of bullion vulnerable to disruption. In the colonies, Silver reshaped landscapes and societies. Roads were carved across mountains to connect mines to ports. Mule trains carried ingots across great distances, and entire cities rose where once there had been only villages. The rhythm of life in places like Potosi revolved around the demands of the mine, dictating labour, trade, and even festivals. Churches gleamed with silver altars, while markets bustled with goods from across the empire. The wealth was real and visible, yet always shadowed by the suffering of those who produced it. The transformation of Europe through silver thus cannot be separated from the experiences of conquest. The conquistadors who had toppled empires opened the way for a flow of resources that reshaped the global economy. Their victories created the conditions for mines to be exploited. Their systems of labour conscription ensured a steady workforce, and their successors built the institutions that managed extraction and trade. The conquest was not only about battles and empires, it was about the creation of an economic order that tied together continents through the medium of silver. The violence of conquest and the extraordinary upheavals that followed did not only transform landscapes and societies, they also gave birth to a dense fabric of stories, legends, and competing narratives. For Spaniards, the deeds of the conquistadors became the stuff of epic memory, tales retold in chronicles, letters, and later histories that sought to glorify triumphs and justify actions. For indigenous peoples, stories of defeat, resistance, and survival circulated in oral traditions and adapted to new circumstances. Across Europe, rivals of Spain seized on these same events to craft the Black Legend, a portrayal of Spaniards as uniquely cruel and tyrannical, a stain that clung to Spain's reputation for centuries. The world of the conquistadors was therefore not only built on arms and silver, but on words and myths that gave meaning to what had happened. From the earliest letters of Hernán Cortés to the court of Charles V, the conquest of Mexico was framed as a saga of courage and divine providence. Cortés presented himself as a loyal servant who, with few men, had brought down a mighty empire through strategy and faith. His letters mixed careful political argument with vivid description, portraying Tenochtitlan as both wondrous and destined to fall. Chronicles like those of Bernal Díaz del Castillo added texture, recounting the experiences of common soldiers who wanted their share of recognition. They described battles, encounters, and marvels, blending memory with embellishment. These texts became foundational for the Spanish narrative, shaping how later generations understood conquest as heroic adventure guided by God's will. In Peru, Francisco Pizarro and his companions also ensured that chroniclers recorded their deeds. Writers like Pedro Chiesa de Leon and Francisco de Xerez emphasized the miraculous capture of Atahualpa, framing it as proof of divine intervention. They depicted the Incas as tyrants ruling over unwilling subjects, thus justifying their overthrow. Spanish narratives consistently portrayed conquest as liberation, the replacement of pagan despotism with Christian order. This rhetorical framework allowed Spaniards to present themselves not as aggressors, but as agents of civilization. Yet within Spain itself, not all voices accepted this uncritically. Missionaries like Bartolomé de las Casas wrote scathing accounts of cruelty, exposing massacres, enslavement, and destruction. His Brevísima Relación circulated widely, painting a picture of Spaniards as butchers whose greed annihilated entire peoples. Though intended to inspire reform and protect indigenous subjects, his descriptions were eagerly seized upon by Spain's rivals. In Protestant Europe, where conflict with Spain was fierce, Las Casas's words became ammunition. Pamphlets, engravings, and polemics spread lurid depictions of Spanish cruelty, from dogs devouring children to fields littered with corpses. These images form the heart of the Black Legend, a narrative that portrayed Spain as uniquely barbarous among European powers. The Black Legend served political ends. For the Dutch, struggling against Spanish rule, it justified rebellion by portraying their overlords as oppressors abroad and at home. For the English, competing on seas and in colonies, it became a moral rationale for challenging Spain's dominance. Tales of cruelty in the Americas were used to argue that Spanish rule was illegitimate, that Catholicism itself bred tyranny, and that Protestant nations had a duty to resist. Thus the horrors of conquest were reframed not only as moral condemnation, but as geopolitical strategy. Spain, once proud of its imperial achievements, found itself vilified as a nation of despots. At the same time, legends emerged within the colonies themselves. Indigenous stories preserved memories of conquest in ways that Spanish chronicles could not. Nahua writers trained in alphabetic script produced accounts like the Florentine Codex, recording how the Mexica experienced the arrival of Cortés. These texts spoke of omens, betrayals, and devastation, preserving an indigenous perspective that contrasted sharply with Spanish triumphalism. In the Andes, oral traditions remembered Atahualpa's capture and execution, portraying him as a tragic figure betrayed by foreigners. Prophecies circulated that the Inca would one day return, keeping alive hopes of restoration long after the empire had fallen. Other legends grew out of the conquistadors themselves, transforming real figures into larger-than-life heroes or villains. Cortés became a symbol of cunning and audacity, his name invoked in both admiration and hatred. Pizarro's tale of humble origins and imperial triumph was retold as proof of opportunity and divine favour, though his assassination revealed the fragility of such power. Stories of treasures lost and hidden proliferated, caches of gold supposedly concealed by fleeing Aztecs, or the ransom of Atahualpa buried before it could be delivered. These myths inspired treasure hunters for centuries, each convinced they might uncover what history had denied. The legend of El Dorado fit neatly into this web of stories, an eternal promise that another empire of wealth lay waiting beyond the next horizon. It was not simply a tale of geography but of psychology, reflecting the insatiable desire for conquest and the refusal to accept limits. Even after countless failures, the idea of a gilded city persisted, its very elusiveness feeding the myth. Similarly, stories of the seven cities of Cibola or Quivira revealed the way disappointment was transformed into new hopes, sustaining exploration long after material results should have cautioned restraint. Myths also enveloped figures who resisted. Atuey in Cuba, Caupolicán and Lautaro among the Mapuche, and Tupac Amaru in Peru became legendary symbols of defiance. Spanish chronicles often demonized them as rebels or idolaters, but over time their names were remembered by indigenous communities as martyrs and heroes. Their stories survived in songs, oral traditions, and later nationalist movements, which drew on them as icons of resistance against colonial rule. Thus, the legends born in the 16th century endured long after the conquistadors themselves had vanished. The Black Legend, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. In the hands of Spain's enemies, it expanded beyond the realities of conquest to depict Spaniards as inherently cruel. Engravings by Theodore de Brie, based on Las Casas' writings, showed Spaniards roasting natives on spits or hurling infants into rivers, images designed to shock European audiences. Whether or not such scenes reflected reality mattered less than the impression they created. Spain became synonymous with brutality. Over time, this reputation hindered Spain's ability to claim moral leadership in Europe. Even achievements in art, science, and exploration were overshadowed by the stain of cruelty. Ironically, other European powers that condemned Spain often engaged in practices equally violent once they established their own colonies. The English, Dutch, and French enslaved Africans, seized lands, and waged brutal wars against indigenous peoples, yet continued to point to Spanish atrocities as evidence of Catholic corruption. The Black Legend thus functioned as propaganda, highlighting Spanish abuses while obscuring those of others. Nonetheless, the fact that such propaganda was effective reflected the undeniable scale of suffering that accompanied Spanish conquest. Within Spain and its colonies, the tension between legend and reality remained. Conquistadors celebrated their achievements in wills, chronicles, and monuments, depicting themselves as loyal servants of God and king. Churches funded by plunder gleamed with silver and gold, their splendour proclaiming divine favour. At the same time, indigenous communities preserved memories of betrayal and loss, weaving them into oral traditions that gave meaning to survival. Missionaries like the Jesuits recorded these memories, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes as evidence of lingering idolatry. The interplay of myths shaped identities for centuries. In Europe, the Black Legend fed Protestant self-righteousness and Spanish defensiveness. In the Americas, legends of resistance fueled cultural pride and future rebellions. For Spaniards themselves, the stories of Cortés, Pizarro and their peers remained contested. Were they heroes who built an empire or tyrants who destroyed civilizations? The answer shifted depending on who told the story and for what purpose. The legacy of these narratives demonstrates that conquest was never only about material domination. It was also about the battle for memory, the struggle to define what had happened and why. Spaniards sought to present conquest as providential, their enemies as barbarous, their victims as liberated. Rivals sought to portray them as monsters. Indigenous peoples remembered differently, preserving stories of loss and defiance. These competing myths coexisted, clashing in chronicles, sermons and propaganda, each shaping how later generations understood the past. By the middle of the 16th century, the age of the conquistadors was already fading. The men who had crossed the ocean in search of empires to topple and treasures to seize belonged to a particular moment in history, one that was rapidly passing. The first conquests had been spectacular, their rewards immediate and vast, but empire required stability, order, and institutions. The monarchy in Spain, wary of letting adventurers grow into independent lords, began tightening its grip, replacing the chaotic heroics of the early decades with bureaucracies, viceroys, and royal armies. The generation of Cortés and Pizarro gave way to administrators, judges and missionaries, men whose ambitions lay less in glory won on battlefields and more in the careful management of subjects and revenues. The conquistadors themselves often found this transition bitter. Hernán Cortés, who had once ruled Mexico with near-sovereign authority, spent his later years embroiled in lawsuits, petitions, and journeys back to Spain in search of recognition. He was granted titles but denied the governorship he craved, treated with suspicion by monarchs who valued his victories but feared his independence. Francisco Pizarro, assassinated in Lima, never lived to see the crown tighten control over Peru. But his brothers and allies discovered that royal officials had little patience for conquistador arrogance. The civil wars of Peru, culminating in the rebellion of Gonzalo Pizarro against the new laws, revealed the impossibility of leaving empire in conquistador hands. The monarchy could not tolerate warlords ruling in its name. In place of the conquistador came the bureaucrat. The Council of the Indies in Spain drafted ordinances, appointed viceroys, and attempted to regulate colonial life down to the smallest detail. The Casa de Contratación in Seville oversaw trade and treasure fleets seeking to channel wealth securely to the crown. In Mexico, the Viceroyalty of New Spain was established, its capital in Mexico City. In Peru, the Viceroyalty of Peru anchored royal authority in Lima. These institutions created a framework of centralized control that gradually pushed aside the conquistador ethos of personal ambition. Yet the transition was neither smooth nor immediate. Many conquistadors clung to their power as encomenderos, ruling over indigenous communities with feudal authority. They married into local elites, creating dynasties that blended Spanish and indigenous nobility. They left behind estates, haciendas, and towns that carried their names. Their descendants entered colonial aristocracies, their claims to status resting on the exploits of forebears. The memory of conquest became a kind of currency, invoked in legal cases and petitions as justification for privileges. Even as royal officials tried to impose order, the legacy of the conquistadors lingered in the social fabric of the colonies. In some regions, however, resistance ensured that conquest remained incomplete. In Chile, the Mapuche War continued for centuries, demanding constant campaigns that consumed resources without decisive victory. On northern frontiers in Mexico, Chichimeca and Apache groups resisted settlement, keeping alive the experience of open warfare. In the jungles of Central America and the mountains of South America, communities preserved autonomy in remote areas. The conquistador ethos survived on these frontiers, where small bands of soldiers still launched raids, built forts, and claimed land through violence. But these were shadows of the great conquests, lacking the spectacular triumphs of Mexico or Peru. For Europe, the legacy of the conquistadors lay in the transformation of wealth, power, and imagination. Silver and gold flooded markets, armies marched under banners financed by American treasure, and Spain projected itself as the leading power of Christendom. Yet the conquistador image was double-edged. At home, they were celebrated in chronicles, ballads, and plays, their deeds woven into national pride. Abroad, they were vilified through the Black Legend, their cruelty used to tarnish Spain's reputation. The conquistador became both hero and villain, admired for courage and reviled for brutality. In the Americas, their legacy was etched into landscapes and memories. Cities like Mexico City and Lima were built upon the ruins of indigenous capitals, physical embodiments of conquest. Churches crowned sacred sites, streets bore Spanish names, and plazas displayed statues of conquerors. Yet beneath the surface, indigenous traditions persisted, languages endured, and syncretic practices blended old and new. The legacy of conquest was thus not erasure but transformation, producing societies that carried the marks of both violence and adaptation. The conquistadors also left behind myths that transcended history. Cortés became a symbol of audacious cunning, Pizarro of ruthless determination, Alvarado of reckless ambition. Stories of treasures lost in mountains, of golden cities still waiting to be found, circulated for centuries. These myths sustained exploration long after the conquistador era had ended, fueling expeditions by Spaniards and rivals alike. In the imagination of Europe, the Americas remained lands of wonder and danger, where fortunes could be made and legends lived. Yet the personal fates of the conquistadors were often grim. Few died content or unchallenged. Cortés, rich but embittered, complained of neglect by the crown. Pizarro was cut down by rivals. Almagro was executed by former allies. Narvaez disappeared at sea. De Soto died in swamps, his body hidden in a river. Even those who survived often spent years entangled in lawsuits, defending their rights against rivals or crown officials. The Age of Conquest was glorious in narrative but harsh in reality, leaving many of its heroes broken by the very system they had helped to create. The enduring legacy of the conquistadors lies in the contradictions they embodied. They were instruments of empire but also threats to royal authority. They were destroyers of civilizations but also founders of new societies. They unleashed suffering on a vast scale, yet they also initiated cultural exchanges that reshaped both the old world and the new. Their actions set in motion processes of colonization, migration, and globalization that continue to shape the modern world. The conquistador era ended not with a single event, but with a gradual absorption of their role into larger structures. By the late 16th century, no new Mexicos or Perus awaited discovery. The great empires had fallen, and remaining frontiers offered only fragmented resistance or diffuse wealth. The monarchy no longer relied on individual adventurers, but on organized expeditions, missionary enterprises, and colonial administrations. The figure of the lone conquistador with sword and banner gave way to armies backed by bureaucracy, to governors and judges whose power came from offices rather than personal daring. Yet the memory of the conquistadors proved impossible to erase. Their names were inscribed on cities, streets, and chronicles. Their stories were told in classrooms and churches, invoked by those who sought to defend colonial order and by those who sought to challenge it. In later centuries, as independence movements swept across the Americas, figures like Cortés and Pizarro were reinterpreted. For some, they remained symbols of tyranny, reminders of oppression to be cast aside. For others, they were woven into national histories as founders of new societies, however violent their methods. The ambiguity of their legacy ensured that they remained present in debates about identity, power, and memory. In the end, the conquistadors were both more and less than their legends. They were men of their time, shaped by the Iberian traditions of war, religion, and ambition, carried by winds of opportunity into lands they could scarcely imagine. They acted with cruelty and courage, folly and foresight, their deeds magnified by chroniclers and distorted by enemies. They did not create the empire alone, nor did they sustain it, but they opened the paths along which it would grow. Their era ended, but the world they had unleashed continued, its consequences unfolding across centuries,